Quick question. If you were cloned after your original body died, would the clone still be you? Or would it be an entirely different person? Let me know your answer in the comments below. Anyway, on to the video. Like all their predicaments in L.A.G, Jeong stepped forward to resolve it. Who else could do it if not him? Dwayne was too smooth-brained to handle such complex situations, and Kara couldn't even be trusted to keep her cheeks consistent, let alone deal with this. Thus, our boy wisely stepped up and sent out his skelly Chad to scout the way. The poor fellow was all too familiar with its expendable nature by now, so it quietly went forward. After walking for a bit, the fog completely consumed it, and it disappeared from the trio's view. Though they hadn't seen what happened, it didn't take a genius to guess the fucker was cooked, and most likely, it wouldn't be coming back. Jeong's action of recalling his shattered bones further confirmed this point. After mulling it over for a bit, Jeong decided to head inside solo. If the lightning fog was too much for the skelly Chad to endure, then it fell on him to stake it out. Obviously, the duo opposed this idea. They deemed it too dangerous, and instead suggested finding a different route to test out. But Jeong rejected their proposal. First of all, he had the lightning skill, and with its effect, he might be able to endure the lightning storm in the fog. Secondly, who's to say the door they'd been looking for wasn't in the fog? Wouldn't it be stupid if they detoured around it only to fuck themselves in the process? No matter the case, this was something he had to do. Kara understood his reasons, but she couldn't help but raise her concerns. She was truly getting a bad feeling from the fog. She confessed that her feelings had never been wrong. Ever since she was a kid, she'd always had a sixth sense about such things, and more often than not, she would be right. In fact, the tragic mystery of her disappearing cheeks had been foreseen by her, and she also knew things would change for the better soon. Jeong gently patted her head to reassure her. He told her not to worry too much. He'd be fine. He was Jeong motherfucking Hyeok. At the very least, he possessed the ability to protect himself, no matter what he faced inside. As for her prediction of her cheeks returning, he could already see them, and gyat damn. Them cheeks were really cheeking at this moment. Though he was reluctant, he forcibly peeled his eyes from the baddie and headed into the fog. As he walked, the worried voices of the duo reached him, telling him to be careful. Kara even said she'd be waiting for him, meaning it wasn't completely hopeless for our virgin Chad. If things aligned for him, then he might just get some cheeks in the future. Fingers crossed. Speaking of the baddie, she worriedly asked Dwayne if Jeong would be alright. Dwayne reassured her. If it was Jeong, then he was sure he'd be okay. The dude was just built different, and he doubted anything would stop him. As the two conversed, the scene switched to Jeong, the subject of Dwayne's glaze. Just like he'd expected, Jeong hadn't faced any difficulties yet, and the task was more like a leisurely walk to him at this point. However, whether or not that would continue to be the case was unclear. Jeong had the electric man and pain relief passive skills, so he was confident he could endure the lightning storm somehow. But for how long, even he didn't know. Well, he was going to give it his all anyway, so there wasn't much point in overthinking it. He immediately braced for impact, letting the lightning storm consume him soon after. When the storm struck, all of Jeong's past bravado completely disappeared. He wailed like a little bitch, forced onto his knees almost immediately. Whatever pain he thought he'd feel, this was way worse. In fact, it was so bad Jeong started to doubt L.A.G. Was this because he had a baddie and some glossy cheeks waiting for him? Because who else but the hating author would punish him to this degree? Well, even if it was him, this alone couldn't shake his resolve. He immediately exerted himself, slowly rising to his feet. Because of his passive skills, his body was slowly but surely adapting to the storm, and it wouldn't be long until he conquered it. And so, with that in mind, Jeong slowly walked forward, delving deeper and deeper into the fog. After seemingly an eternity of pain, he finally walked out of the fog, finding himself on the opposite side of the hall. The first thing he did was assess his situation, and to his shock, he realized that he'd powered up. Because of his electric man skill, the storm was like a supercharger to him. It further buffed his abilities, giving him unprecedented power. The only shame was that the buff was temporary, and he could only use it once before it completely disappeared. Even so, this was still a significant advantage, and Jeong couldn't help but feel more reassured about his incoming scout. After walking for a bit, a noteworthy change finally appeared before Jeong. It was another door, similar to the one that brought them to that section of the labyrinth. He wasted no time, instantly entering through the door. What met him was another dark hallway, this one way darker than the last. In the depths of the shadows, several obscured figures reigned, quietly whispering amongst themselves. Jeong immediately went on high alert. He activated his owl eyes, finally getting a clear view of the room. All around him were those weird naked freaks, the same nudist bastards as Derek, chest to nuts. As he noticed them, the nudist colony also noticed Jeong, and their whispers instantly shifted to discussing him. They brought up the fact that Jeong had managed to arrive there while still intact. Evidently, he had a lightning skill to deal with the fog lightning storm. But so what? He was still going to die there, and there wasn't much he could do about it. The leader of the nudists initiated contact. She asked Jeong why he was staying quiet even after seeing them, but Jeong ignored her. He instead focused on what the nudists had been whispering about. From their short discussion, he deduced that the reason the bastards were charred black was because of the lightning storm. As for what the exact details were, he still had no idea. He then asked his own question, inquiring whether he'd find the Minotaurus if he proceeded forward. The black-faced motherfuckers collectively laughed at his question, finding it hilarious. Their leader, Glenn Ryder, responded to Jeong's question. She told him that the boss's room was indeed ahead, but whether or not he'd find the boss inside the room was unknown. Jeong nodded to her reply before asking another question. Were they still human? Glenn responded rather smugly. Of course they were human. It's just that they were an evolved species of humans. They were faster, stronger, felt no pain, and most importantly, if you could overlook the black face, then they were naked walking fan service for all to enjoy. The only limitation, which wasn't actually a disadvantage in their books, was that they had an insatiable desire to consume flesh, specifically human flesh. So, him walking in there was like a lucky turn for them, almost like he'd personally delivered himself to be devoured. Jeong snickered at her comment before replying. First of all, if there was anyone who was lucky, then it had to be him and the homies watching this video. Because how often would they get a chance to see some anime boobies and nippies? And secondly, it seemed she didn't know who he was. He was the big dog, MILF hunting, Jeong motherfucking Hyeok. The only thing he came to deliver was their deaths. Glenn said bet to his bold words before commanding the nudist colony to attack. And as expected from these barbaric fuckers, they were all cheeks out as they charged at our boy. Jeong responded in kind. He immediately activated his limitation form, urging the bastards to come at him. Since they were fiends who confessed to loving human meat, especially his meat, he didn't need to hold back against them. He would clap them all, specifically this bastard who decided to flash a lot more than just cheeks. Pause. As the cheeky fuckers charged at him, Jeong entered his karate, whoop-ass fighting stance. He channeled his left-right goodnight, lightning punch, driving his fist into the nudist's face. The blow was so powerful that its eye burst out before it was yeeted into the sky. Obviously, its partners didn't take this lying down. They charged at Jeong from the left, the right, and even from above, successfully completing a three-way pincer attack. But Jeong wasn't flustered. He gathered his energy before shooting it all out, sinking the entire room into his lightning domain. Wherever the bolt struck, chaos reigned, zapping the living shit out of the nudists. However, despite the CHADY display, the bastards weren't that easy to deal with. Only a single nudist suffered lethal damage, while the rest just tanked it. Even though they'd be dazed for a while, it wouldn't affect the general battle much. Jeong immediately noticed this and went on high alert. He identified the black color on the nudist's skin as the true cause of their survival. From his analysis, the color wasn't just a convenient effect for the author to hide the good stuff. It also served as an insulator, protecting the naked folk from lightning. Since things had turned out like that, Jeong instantly changed his fighting style. He switched to the in-your-face bitch slap and cheek slash instead of ranged lightning strikes. With the choice made, Jeong immediately acted on it. He sidekicked the hell out of the first nudist, sending it flying like a broken kite. One of the nudists capitalized on this moment to launch a sneak attack, but Jeong easily dodged that sly hoe. He responded with a vertical slash, aiming straight for its skull. Though the attack landed and dealt significant damage, it was still pointless, because the bastard had purposely sacrificed its arm, saving its life and stalling Jeong in the process. If he continued to fight at this tempo, he'd soon be swarmed and jumped. His defeat wouldn't be surprising afterward. Jeong realized this and changed his fighting style again. This time, he went for the punch-a-bitch no jutsu, yeeting the crap out of a nudist. For the rest of the charging bastards, he yelled at them to come at him. There was plenty of ass where that whoop came from. And he meant it too, because he immediately dished out 2 killer crosses, clocking 2 bastards in the jaw. Unfortunately, his momentum was disrupted by a sneak attack from the back, causing him to groan in pain. In fact, if it wasn't for his absurd passive skills, he might have fractured his spine from that blow. Luckily, he was him, and he instantly recovered, countering with a forehead block. The attacking nudist was caught off guard by such an odd move, leaving it open for a counterattack. Jeong didn't waste this opportunity and directly shoved his fist into the fucker's mouth. He channeled his electricity and burst its head, sending chunks of flesh flying like a squashed tomato. Another foe closed in for a sneak attack, but Jeong instantly responded, bitch slapping the hell out of it. He then followed up with a sweep attack before finishing it off with a stomp to the head. As he was busy dealing with the first nudists, another one pulled up behind him again, going for yet another sneak attack. This time, however, things were different. Jeong's danger sense suddenly flared, warning him of an impending calamity. He didn't hesitate or question it, just dived to the side to dodge. Luckily, he did, because the attack turned out to be so powerful that literal shockwaves were heard from the force. When Jeong saw this, he immediately opened his second door of limitation. The new nudist was obviously different from the rest, and playing around wouldn't do him any good. He first stepped on its foot before cocking his hand back for a killer uppercut. Because its leg was trapped, the fiend didn't fly away, but instead remained firmly within Jeong's grasp. Our boy didn't hesitate to give it the Wayne Brady treatment, firmly choking that hoe. And since he was him, he ruthlessly tore off its neck, taking a chunk of flesh as his battle spoils. Surprisingly, even though its neck was torn off, the bastard didn't immediately die. It first glazed our boy, telling him he was hella strong. The rest of the colony saw their leader fall and immediately went into a frenzy. They charged at Jeong with madness, disregarding their own lives. However, before they could send themselves to their doom, a loud voice called for them to retreat. And although reluctant, they all pulled back. Jeong was left alone in the middle, and honestly, he looked like shit. When Jeong saw them retreating, he flashed an evil smile. His face was particularly demonic, with the blood trickling down like tears. The nudists witnessed this and became enraged. Did this Jeong bastard really think they were afraid of him? They collectively charged forward, disregarding their orders to retreat. Jeong smiled even broader at this. This was exactly what he wanted. He immediately summoned back his bone blade, making a wide slash around him. When the dust settled, we realized that the slash wasn't just to farm some aura. Our boy had actually extended his bone blade, cutting through the encirclement of nudists like butter. The slash was so devastating that several limbs were cut in the process, the nudists forever maimed as a consequence. Glenn's heart bled at this loss. She bellowed at the colony to retreat, this time her voice leaving no room for defiance. The nudists wisely listened and backpedaled, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and Jeong. When she saw her colony was safe, Glenn heaved a sigh of relief before addressing Jeong once again. She asked him to join them. He was to abandon his humanity and become a nudist like them. She promised the change would be extremely beneficial to him, an improvement in strength being just the basics. But Jeong instantly shot her down. He had no desire to crawl on walls and eat humans, let alone be butt naked and flash his cheeks across the manhwa panels. If he did that, then the Chad Not would have a hard time saying pause after every scene, which, in truth, would be quite a chore. However, if he were being honest, the boost in their physical characteristics was indeed quite tempting. If he took her up on that offer, who knows how many inches he'd gain as a result. Pause. Glenn sighed at his refusal before saying something about food, but honestly, I couldn't care less because my full focus was on them melons and nippies. Damn, holy melons. Luckily, Jeong wasn't as thirsty as I was. He fully focused on Glenn, racking his brain to figure out an escape plan. It wasn't that he was afraid of them. On the contrary, he was quite confident he could clap any of them in a one-on-one duel. However, the current situation wouldn't allow that. The bastards would definitely swarm him, and their numbers were too many for him to launch an effective counterattack. There was always the option of opening the third limitation door, but Jeong quickly ruled out that idea. The backlash and unknown consequences were too severe for him to casually make that move. So long as he wasn't forced to, he wouldn't make that choice. Jeong then thought about his other options, one of them being retreating to the lightning storm to recharge. However, this idea was also eliminated. If he did that, then there was a huge possibility he'd draw the enemy with him and implicate Dwayne and Kara in the process. Dwayne was okay. He could go die as far as he was concerned. But Kara couldn't die. She'd promised him some cheeks after all. If great wars could be fought because of cheeks, why couldn't he sacrifice his life for the same? That was just pure logic. Well, more like CHADY logic. With so many ideas ruled out, Jeong was left in an awkward situation. He didn't know what to do, and Glenn was also adding pressure to the situation by commanding her soldiers to attack. If it wasn't for her glorious peaks and nippies, then Jeong would be hella upset with her. Too bad she held the visual advantage in this case. Just when his situation was at rock bottom and his demise was proving inevitable, an idea suddenly struck Jeong. He ignored the charging nudists and locked all the fuck in. When the first nudist lunged at him, his aura suddenly turned dark. So dark that the limitation demonic aura was nothing in comparison. Official debut, the madness skill had finally been unleashed. While under the effects of madness, the whole world seemed to have slowed down before Jeong. The nudists were moving so slow it was almost like they were toying with him. But Jeong knew this wasn't a game. He also knew the nudists weren't slow at all. It was his speed that was ridiculously fast. In fact, he was so fast that bitch slapping and Brady choking the nudists wouldn't be a challenge to him. With this realization, Jeong immediately started his counterattack. He first grabbed the leading nudist, breaking its arm in the process. He then grabbed its face, flashed a sadistic smile, before ripping that fucker clean off. Just when I thought he couldn't get more savage, Jeong actually threw the face, yeeting another nudist in the face with it. He followed up with a lunge before karate chopping the shit out of the second nudist. Under the might of his blow, the poor fellow lost its eye, the bastard popping right off. A third nudist used that chance to strike back, kicking Jeong straight in the jaw. But Jeong easily tanked that shit, launching his counterattack immediately after. He grabbed the fool's leg before punching straight through its skull. Yes, I shit you not. Our boy straight up punched through a skull. Talk about aura. The rest of the nudists saw this and doubled their assault. It was obvious how livid they were. But again, Jeong wasn't flustered. He simply grabbed his third victim and threw it at them, playing a real-life version of whack-a-bitch, whack-a-mole. Unfortunately, his long session of aura farming finally came to an end with Glenn's ambush. And just like her name, she rode that heel deep into Jeong's spine. Or maybe it was his ass. It was hard to tell from this angle. However, from how his legs were curled up like that, I'm leaning towards the latter. She then comboed the assault, kicking the hell out of our boy. Jeong instantly found himself in quite a pathetic situation. Not only was his ass getting whooped, but he also couldn't get an opening to counterattack, meaning this ass whooping was going to last for a while. But even if that was the case, it wasn't like he was completely helpless. Though Glenn's speed was absurdly high, so high that he couldn't quite keep up, he could still follow her movements with his eyes. If he used that fact and predicted her actions, then it wasn't hard to counter. Just like this. Gotcha, bitch. He grabbed hold of Glenn, scaring the shit out of the latter. With his sadistic smile still radiating, Jeong tightened his grip, breaking Glenn's arm like a twig. The overwhelming pain sent the black baddie into a frenzy. She responded with an upper kick, clocking Jeong straight in the jaw. But our boy didn't relent. He exerted more force, yanking Glenn's arm from her body. Before the baddie could scream, Jeong clasped her mouth, then her face, before lifting her into the air. Through CHADY dominance, he slammed that hoe into the ground, crushing the whole floor in the process. Jeong smiled at this massacre, but deep down, he was hella anxious. This wasn't him. He'd completely lost himself to the skill, and currently, even his body wasn't under his control. If he couldn't snap himself back, then there was a huge possibility he might just die there. Damn it, Lag, just how many traps do you have? As Jeong was still cursing the hellish game, his hand instinctively pressed harder on Glenn's neck, firmly choking that hoe. And contrary to what I was expecting, the bitch actually died, leaving behind her soul and, of course, a quick peek at them cheeks. Jeong sighed regretfully at the concealing paint before shifting his focus to the rest of the nudists. If the Chads watching couldn't get a clear view of Glenn's plot, then he might as well compensate them by clapping some nudists' cheeks. Luckily, the bastards had fallen into chaos after losing their leader, so stomping on them wouldn't be much of a challenge to him. He immediately acted on this, charging forward with the momentum of a crazed beast. The first to feel his wrath was nudist number, who gives a fuck, who instantly got cleaved in half, his innards scattered across the labyrinth floor. Jeong then pounced on the second and third nudists, decapitating one and ripping the throat of the other. He then turned to the next nudist, digging his claws into its guts and pulling out its innards. When even that wasn't enough to satiate his frenzy, he lunged at the next nudist, ripping out its tongue. Just like a crazed fiend, Jeong continued his massacre, blood and flesh chunks continuously littering the ground. When the last of the nudists fell, he raised his head and roared, venting out the darkest of his carnage desires. All around him were the mangled corpses of the nudists, most of them maimed beyond recognition, and the culprit for this massacre just stood there, idly enjoying the bloodshed. You might be fooled into thinking he was contemplating his actions, but in truth, he'd already forgotten about them. Instead, he focused on how he could effectively use the souls. Though it was sad they'd been killed and forgotten so easily, this was L.A.G. Expecting compassion from this hell was pure lunacy. And unfortunately, the lunacy extended not just to the nudists, but to Jeong as well. Since the madness skill was still in effect, Jeong found himself charging for the door, his own wishes be damned. The crazed look and bloodlust were all his consciousness needed to realize what his body was planning. The mad fool was going after Dwayne and Kara. It seemed the madness hadn't had enough carnage and was thus targeting the squad. Jeong instantly knew this was a problem, but he was helpless to resolve it. While under the effect of madness, his body was not in his control, so he couldn't stop even if he wanted to. Although he cried bitterly inside, he already knew he would be the cause of Dwayne's and Kara's deaths, likely ripping them to pieces. But who was he? He was Jeong Hyeok. How could he give up so easily? How could he lose to a mediocre skill? He immediately locked in, wrestling for control of his legs. With that as a foundation, Jeong controlled his lower body, finally putting an end to his charge. Through gritted teeth, he held on with all his might before eventually ridding himself of the madness effect. After a series of deep breaths, Jeong acknowledged his good luck for once. If he hadn't been nearing the end of the madness skill, he wouldn't have been able to hold on, and who knows what might have happened to Dwayne and Kara. Luckily, the situation was salvaged, and he could still collect the glossy cheeks Kara promised him. As he walked back to the nudist's room, Jeong reflected on the intricacies of the madness skill. Although it was undoubtedly overpowered, he decided not to use it casually unless he was truly at death's door. Such a skill was too risky, especially since he had his squad with him. Locking back in, Jeong leisurely collected the souls from the nudists, and thanks to their generous donations, he now had a whopping 370 souls to spare. He giddily pocketed all the souls, even entertaining the thought of sharing some with Dwayne and Kara. Dwayne wasn't all that important, but how would Kara react? Would she introduce him to her brother, Hawk 2, as thanks? Or maybe her sister, Gawk 3000? Both cases would be fine, and honestly, he'd take anything at this point. Following Jeong's glare, the thirsty narrator refocused on the story. He shifted his attention to the dark hallway, a lone door hidden in its depths. Jeong quickly approached the door before cautiously heading inside. When he did, a system notification popped up announcing that he'd entered the main room of the labyrinth. Jeong ignored the notification as he silently studied the room. To his shock, he discovered the room had an uncanny resemblance to the starting point of L.A.G, the very same room that had started this shit. Even though he was shaken, he quickly calmed down before looking for the familiar lever hidden in the wall. Pressing it opened a secret door, just like in the starting room. With zero hesitation, Jeong walked into the light, slowly entering the crystal room. As he scanned the familiar sight, another notification sounded, informing him that he could morph into a labyrinth resident in that room. As for who the residents were, they were obviously the nudists. The process was simple. All he had to do was place his hand on the terminal, and the system would handle the rest. If he did that, then he'd receive all the perks of the nudists, and then some. Jeong mulled it over as he slowly unraveled the mysteries of the transformation. From his deduction, he realized that all his accumulation, his skills, and souls would be traded in for the passive skill Labyrinth Man. It was this skill that gave the fucker nudists the abilities they had. Were he to accept, he would evolve into a being more suited for darkness, while his grade and characteristics would be determined by his accumulation. At level 3, he wouldn't be able to walk or talk, just like the fallen Derek Chestnut. At level 4, he'd be just like Clint, barely able to talk while significantly stronger than level 3. At level 5, he'd be like Glenn, stronger than level 4 and able to communicate fluently. Of course, he wouldn't have the holy melons and cakes Glenn had, but that's neither here nor there. As for levels above 5, he was sure they existed, but the system didn't share details about them. Thinking back to the nudists, Jeong realized they already knew the exit's location. It was just that they couldn't defeat the Minotaur, so they were forced to stay there. From their actions, he deduced that the bastards were probably biding their time, hunting new arrivals, and leveling up their nudist skill with hopes of defeating the Minotaur in the future. Too bad all their plans and preparations went belly up because of him. But if that was the case, how did the bastards get their resistance to lightning? Was that also a part of their transformation? This question stumped Jeong, and he couldn't figure it out no matter how hard he thought about it. Luckily, he didn't have to sweat too much, as L.A.G easily gave him an answer. The solution was insulator paint. It would protect the user from electricity if sprayed all over the body. Turns out the nudists weren't just doing so to hide the cheeks. The black paint had tactical significance all along. Of course, just because it's tactical doesn't mean we can overlook its heinous crimes. Do you know how many times I zoomed in on them cheeks to no avail? Someone has to answer for that, and I'm blaming this stupid paint. Jeong also got heated after receiving the paint, but his focus was on something else entirely. He realized that Dwayne and Kara would also be able to cross the lightning fog if they used the paint, but that was only secondary. What was truly important was that Kara had to be butt naked to use the paint, not to mention the nosebleed sight of her covered in spray. If things turned out well, both he and the homies watching this might just get the feast of a lifetime. Itadakimasu. With that glorious view in mind, Jeong resolutely headed back. How could he afford to waste time at such an important moment? He quickly left the crystal room, running back to the oblivious Kara. As he ran, he reflected on his journey in L.A.G so far. Initially, his goal was to survive and escape L.A.G, but things were different now. Not only did he want to escape, he also wanted to bring Kara and Dwayne with him. Escaping alone wasn't enough for him anymore. He wanted to save the duo and get the hell out of there together. Sure, it was going to be hard as fuck, but he was Jeong motherfucking Hyeok. He'd make it work somehow. Just as he was in high spirits, L.A.G spawned in to remind him what kind of place this was. It was hell, and such bitchy ideas wouldn't be tolerated. Before him was a ruined and bloody battlefield, an obvious indication that some shit had definitely happened to the duo. Jeong's heart sank at the sight, and he couldn't help but yell out Kara's name. Damn it, L.A.G. If something happens to her before he collects his owed cheeks, I won't forgive you. Jeong ignored the narrator's pointless banter and rushed forward. As far as he was concerned, Not's thirsty behavior came second. What was truly important was finding his crew. He looked around the room, calling out Dwayne and Kara's names, but what answered him were mere echoes. The duo was nowhere to be seen. An overwhelming feeling of anger and panic assaulted Jeong, and he couldn't help but punch the ground to vent his emotions. Damn it. What was this development? He'd just vowed to escape with the duo. Was he going to fail even before he started? What kind of shit luck was this? He didn't know who or what was responsible for this, whether they were a group or a solo unit. But one thing was for certain. He would kill them all. He would make sure they regretted ever laying their dirty hands on his crew, especially his baddie, Kara. Damn it. He hadn't even held her hand yet. Was he really destined to die a tragic virgin in this game? He hoped the fuck not. Calming his wild heart, Jeong quickly used a skill to regain his composure. I would have mentioned the exact name of the skill, but I'm pretty sure it's not self-composure, as mentioned in the translation. In fact, I'm so confident I could bet my left nut and Dwayne's right titty that it's not that. The translators are just doing whatever they want at this point. Anyway, after using the definitely not self-composure skill, Jeong finally regained some clarity. This wasn't the time to lose himself in rage. It would only blind him and cause him to make mistakes. He needed to be calm. Only then would he be able to pick up the duo's trail and save them, if it was possible. With that in mind, Jeong quickly scanned the battlefield, doing his best to scour every inch of it. Thanks to his attention to detail, he quickly found valuable clues to pursue. One of them was smoke from Kara's fire skill. Another was wreckage from Dwayne's roar skill. Both were still fresh, so the duo must have left just recently. From the traces and the other clues, the signs pointed to them retreating into the lightning fog. However, if that was true, then things didn't bode well for them. Ignoring the ever-deepening pit in his gut, Jeong continued his investigation into the lightning fog. After a bit of tracking, he found the duo's traces, but they disappeared just as quickly as they appeared. With the limited info he had, there was no way of telling what had happened, but if the duo had been forced into the lightning without the paint to protect them, then their demise was proving all the more likely. Although it was sad to think about, there was indeed a high probability of that happening, so denying it was just pure ignorance. However, even if he was the most ignorant person alive, he decided to trust in the squad and ignore the clues. So what if the signs were clear? He was willing to bet his squad wouldn't die so easily. Forget Kara, because the mortality rate of baddies in L.A.G was horrendous. His hopes mainly lay in Dwayne. The giant unit was definitely him, so surviving shouldn't be a problem. And if he looked out for a brother and saved his baddie, then that would be even better. With renewed hope and a calmer heart, Jeong immediately returned to the crystal room. Since he was betting on his squad's survival, he had to do his part to survive as well. And the first thing was to clap the Minotaur. After finding and activating the hidden switch in the wall, Jeong watched calmly as the trapdoor activated, opening up a path to the boss room. Although he was itching for a glorious fight, he wasn't stupid. He also knew moving forward without Dwayne and Kara would be hella hard, so caution was necessary. The first thing he needed to do was calm himself and level up. Only then would he have a chance of survival. Thus, he quickly burned through his souls, leveling up a shit ton of skills. You can pause the video to get the exact details because ain't no way I'm reading all that shit. However, as compensation, feel free to imagine me nibbling on your ear. I'm sure that'll make the reading more pleasurable. You're welcome. After bawling the hell out and going on his leveling spree, Jeong successfully upgraded his skills, leaving only 7 souls as backup. With his preparations complete, he resolutely walked into the boss's room, ready to clap some Minotaur cheeks. However, as typical of L.A.G, things wouldn't be so simple. The moment he entered the room, the door immediately closed, blocking any routes for retreat. Not only that, he realized he wasn't the only person in the room. In fact, there were so many people, you'd think they were holding a party or something. Most of them were cool, with killer character designs, but some were just fucked up. Seriously, what in the Zuckerberg is this? With so many new arrivals and so much info to digest, Jeong almost missed the dead Minotaur on the floor. Turns out the boss was already dead, so his trip was for naught. But if that was the case, how come the system hadn't announced the mission's completion? Was there still something cooking in the background, or was L.A.G up to its shenanigans again? Just as he was pondering this point, a figure broke out of the group and silently approached him. He called out to Jeong, yelling that he reeked of blood. This nosy bastard was Jeremy Stone, who, like his name, had them stony abs. His public attribute was an increase in his sense of smell, and currently, his highest skill level was 22. Jeremy went on to question Jeong, asking why he reeked of blood. In fact, his scent was even worse than his own, and he was already a certified lunatic. But Jeong didn't answer. Instead, he raised his vigilance. Since Jeremy went through the trouble of closing the distance, he must be a close-range specialist. And adding that to his constant bullshit yapping, it was clear the bastard wanted some smoke. But to think he would so casually approach him alone. Just how confident was he in his skills? 2 more members broke out of the group, silently reinforcing Jeremy. One of them told him to cut his shit. This was L.A.G. Everyone reeked of blood in that hell. But Jeremy was adamant. He insisted that Jeong's stench was on another level. In fact, it was almost like he'd soaked in a pool of blood before coming there. Not to mention his highest skill level, 30. That wasn't a number that could be reached by ordinary means. Without a doubt, this Jeong bastard was one hell of a freak. The lizard motherfucker took this chance to approach Jeong. He directly extended an invitation, asking Jeong to join them. The other reinforcement quickly rejected the idea. He explained that the group was already in chaos. Most of them were already trying to kill each other. Adding Jeong would only make things worse. Jeremy countered his argument, insisting that it would be fine. And if he was referring to the time he had almost killed him, then that was already in the past. He should go ahead and forget it. Hadn't he apologized enough already? The headband bastard became enraged by his nonchalant attitude. He called Jeremy a coward, a real scam to call a teammate. Jeremy told him to cut the bullshit. He then said some racist shit, but I'm in no mood to translate as bullshit. The two instantly became heated, charging toward each other soon after. Just as they were about to clash, a third person joined the fray, perfectly blocking the two. He chastised them for being reckless, especially since they had a troublesome guest before them. Jeong also studied this foe, noting that he was hella fast. To be able to move with such speed, the bastard must have an acceleration skill or something. But if that was the case, did the skill affect only his movements? Or could he dish out speedy thrusts like the Flash? Pause. After being stopped, Jeremy instantly became a diss buffet, dishing out disses like crazy. Everyone became victims of his strays, and the whole group descended into madness. The commotion continued until the lizard Zuckerberg called for them to shut it. He warned Jeremy to watch himself. There was a limit to his tolerance and generosity. Jeremy instantly cowered, apologizing soon after. His face might be troubling, but it seemed this lizard fucker was the real deal. The only maiden in the group spoke up at that time. She called the men a bunch of idiots. How could they argue with a possible enemy before them? She was Morgane Doubled, and I'm sure if she removed the mask, my schlong would doubled in an instant. Currently, her highest skill level was 26. Jeong watched the madness before dissing the group. They were really a mess. Well, even if they were a train wreck, it had nothing to do with him because there was no way in hell he'd join them anyway. Jeremy heard Jeong's condescension and immediately got heated. He mad-dogged Jeong, asking what gave him the confidence to speak so brazenly. Jeong told him to cut the chit-chat. If he wanted smoke, then they should get on with it. Jeremy responded with, bet. He indeed wanted that smoke. Jeong told him, cool. That was exactly what he wanted as well. He'd been feeling rather awful lately, and a target to vent his frustration on was exactly what he needed. Since Jeremy had so generously volunteered to get smoked, he'd graciously accept and tear that ass up. No homo, of course. Jeremy involuntarily took a step back at Jeong's words. He'd known L.A.G was a harsh place, but who would have thought his delicate ass would be at risk as well? If that was the direction of this fight, then he might as well stop. He'd leave that sort of thing to Diddy. Jeong smiled at his tense face. It was exactly as he thought. More often than not, the loudest people were the most cowardly. If Jeremy was really about that smoke, he wouldn't be talking so much. He would have attacked immediately. Talking meant he was a coward, and cowards tended to die quickly in L.A.G. The rest of the party heard his words and didn't dispute them. On one hand, they were really tired of this Jeremy bastard. On the other hand, they were wary of Jeong, and sacrificing Jeremy to probe his abilities was a worthwhile trade in their books. So what if Jeremy died? It had nothing to do with them. In fact, it would be better for them if he did. The only thing they required was for him to draw out Jeong's abilities before he bit the dust. Jeong eyed the group and immediately knew what they were thinking. But so what? Was Jeong Big Papi Hyeok so easy to manipulate? If these fools thought they'd get their way so easily, they were dreaming. He would wreck any schemes they had and kill anyone who dared stand in his way. But first, he should get rid of this Jeremy fucker because he was also getting tired of his nonsense yapping. He easily sidestepped Jeremy's stab, causing the latter's attack to miss pathetically. Jeremy didn't let up. He instead doubled his assault, sending a flurry of stabs at Jeong. Jeong read the attacks and nimbly dodged them all. Such puny attacks weren't a threat to him. He then changed the tempo, clocking Jeremy square in the jaw. The blow left Jeremy dazed, forcing him to activate his trump card. 2 more daggers flew from his pants, joining his offensive. But how could Jeong let him do as he pleased? He rapidly closed in, his fist coated in lightning. With a mighty punch, he tore through Jeremy's jaw, sending the latter flying. Just like that, a cocky bastard fell. His yapping maw mangled beyond repair. Jeong nonchalantly collected his soul before turning to the party. What would they do now? Would they fight, or nah? The group remained silent for a while before this creepy Zuckerberg fucker spoke up. He expressed his nonchalance at Jeremy's death, but that didn't mean they wouldn't do anything about it. Though they hated the fool, he was still part of their group, so revenge was definitely appropriate. However, that was only his opinion. The rest would decide for themselves through a vote. After a bit of back and forth, the group settled for a split decision. Half wanted to attack, while the rest wanted to retreat. Jeong told them not to think too much. They'd get clapped regardless. In fact, his hands were rated E for everyone, so they could all get it. If they were still hesitant, they should just gang up on him. He was down for whatever. Lizardmark eyed him before frowning at his confidence. Since he was being that bold, it meant he was a monster, and such freaks weren't easy to kill. Even if it was possible, he didn't see the need to risk it for just Jeremy, so he wisely stepped back, dispelling any ideas of retaliation. As the two sides settled their dispute, the panel switched to the Minotaur. And just as we've grown to expect from L.A.G, some shit was brewing in the background. The corpse started to squirm before a bloody silhouette burst out from within. This sudden change caught everyone off guard, and they all collectively turned to face the new foe. Jeong, in particular, was getting a really bad feeling from the freak, a feeling that only amplified when he heard the bastard scream. No matter what it was, he knew shit was cooked, and it was about time he got his ass out of there. The new foe, the Burning Man, as the system called it, also studied the group, its eyes shining in amusement. It then locked in, its head setting ablaze. Before the group could react, the fiend lunged forward, grabbing Rushing Man by the face. The group gasped at the absurd speed before quickly backpedaling to save themselves. As for Rushing Man, he was left in the foe's hands, his head slowly setting ablaze. One team member rushed in to save him, stabbing Burning Man in the flank. Unfortunately, he was useless and got caught as well. Under the group's horrified gazes, the duo were killed, their heads reduced to cinders. And the worst part? They were completely helpless. They couldn't do shit to the fiend. Another team member charged forward, striking B-Man in the arm. Because of his bombing skill, the strike was actually effective, managing to sever its arm. But just like the last one, the fool was quickly yeeted, dying pathetically soon after. With 3 bodies to its name, Burning Man slowly walked forward, its domineering aura pressing down on the group. Jeong watched this, and the sickening feeling in his gut got more intense. He instinctively realized, fucking around at this point would instantly get him killed, especially since B-Man seemed to have absurd regeneration as well. No matter the case, now was the time to lock in. He couldn't afford to be careless. With that in mind, he called out to Lizard Mark, inquiring if he had some healing potions. The weird fool replied that he had some. But why was he asking? Jeong replied that it was obvious. He was going to clap some Burning Man cheeks. If the lizard could give him the potions, then he would help them kill the boss. If not, then they would all die there. The choice was up to him. Oh, and before he decided, he should know. He had some glossy cheeks waiting for him, so he better not fuck around. Pause. Jeong continued to urge, or rather, extort, the group. He told them to hand over their health potions, otherwise, he wouldn't move an inch even if the B-Man clapped them all. They might not have realized this, but the Burning Man hadn't looked at him since it appeared. His guess was that it was focused on the group that killed the Minotaur, so he should be safe until it killed them all. Lizard heard his analysis and frowned slightly. Now that he thought about it, there was indeed some truth to Jeong Bastard's words. But did they really have to give up their potions? Just as he was struggling with the choice, another member of the group stepped up. He cockily told Jeong to step back. He didn't need help from a petty bastard like him. Jeong told him to do as he pleased. He wouldn't care either way, even if the Burning Man tenderized his black ass. The Black Pirate told him, bet, he didn't need his help or concern anyway. He would solo the B-Man, so Jeong better stand back and watch. Saying so, he decisively dashed forward, activating a skill in the process. The skill was the fire resistance skill, so the fool had great confidence against the boss. He connected a right jab, sending the foe reeling. Just as he was about to celebrate his victory, the tables suddenly turned, catching him completely off guard. The Burning Man abruptly counterattacked, setting his arm ablaze. The cocky fool cried out in pain, horrified by the sudden change. But before he could piece together what the hell was going on, the B-Man pressed the attack, grabbing him by the head. Under the group's stunned gazes, the Burning Man tore off his head, incinerating it soon after. Jeong watched this passively before directing his focus to the surviving duo. He told them to make up their minds, lest they end up like Black Pirate. If they still insisted on stalling for time, then he'd abandon them, and he wouldn't help even if they begged him. Lizard considered his request before calling out to Morgane. He instructed her to hand over her potion, and although she was unwilling, she had no choice but to comply. Following her action, he also handed over his health potion, completing their side of the deal. Jeong received the items and couldn't help but smile. With the two serving as reassurance, he was free to crush out. Although he had no idea how bad things would get after he used madness and limitation, at the very least his life wouldn't be in danger. Thus, his frown gradually eased. Lizard saw his relaxed demeanor and threatened immediately. If he couldn't kill the boss, even after extorting them, then he'd forget everything and kill him instead. Jeong told him not to get ahead of himself. He couldn't kill him even if he tried, and besides, if he failed to kill the boss, then both of them would definitely die. So what's the point of threatening him? He encouraged them to stay still and watch as he saved their pitiful asses. With those words, Jeong immediately locked in. He traced the boss's gaze, realizing that it was still focused on the duo. Since that was the case, he'd be a fool if he didn't exploit it. He resolved to finish it in one move, lest Lag did the Lag thing and curveballed his ass. As for the exact strategy, he had a bunch to pick from, with the fourth door being one of them. However, that was just an idea. He wouldn't be stupid enough to actually try it. He hadn't even opened the third door, so opening the fourth door was pure lunacy, even if he had the medicine as backup. Speaking of the third door, he decided to give it a spin, and boy, was it OP. His aura suddenly radiated, suppressing the entire room. Jeong felt the power and couldn't help but gasp in surprise. If the third door was already this intense, then the fourth door would definitely tear him apart. Good thing he hadn't been greedy enough to directly open the fourth door. The duo saw his new form and asked if he was okay. He'd talked big game earlier, so how come he looked so terrible even before the fight began? If he ended up dying before actually fighting the boss, then that would truly be a joke. Jeong told them not to worry. Despite how he looked, he was golden. He warned them to stand back since the boss was attacking. He also cautioned them against moving even if the boss targeted them. Lizard heard his last words and immediately shouted for an explanation. Who would be stupid enough to stand still when their lives were on the line? Jeong told him to trust him. He had his reasons. Lizard said, "Bullshit," to that. If he couldn't properly explain himself, then he wasn't doing shit. Jeong replied that he had no time to explain it to him. If he wanted to survive, then he'd better trust him and stay still. Lizard shouted for an answer, but Jeong swiftly disappeared, leaving him to face the charging boss. An overwhelming fear and panic assaulted his weird ass, but he desperately held on, doing his best to stay still. Just as the boss's fist was about to crush his skull, Lizard couldn't take it anymore and shouted at Jeong to save him. Our boy spawned above the fiend, his bone blade ready. He yelled for Lizard to stay still, since everything was still in his control. Saying so, he activated his lightning skill, slashing the burning man cleanly in half. The force from the blow kicked up a lightning storm, creating a huge crater on the ground. Jeong gasped for breath, clearly strained by the power. He wisely deactivated the skill, choosing to minimize the backlash as much as possible. In addition, he also used the health potion, hoping it would speed up his recovery. With that done, he shifted his focus to the dying boss. However, even after a while, the system still hadn't sounded, meaning shit wasn't over just yet. Jeong frowned at this sight, wondering what was going on. Had his prediction been wrong and the Burning Man wasn't the true owner of the labyrinth? Or was there another owner lurking in the shadows somewhere? No matter the case, things weren't looking good, and it seemed Lag was about to start some bullshit again. Lizard also caught on to the problem and asked Jeong what was up. Was he sure the boss was dead? Or was it just pretending? Morgane replied that it was definitely dead, especially since its body was all burnt up. However, before she could expound some more, a sudden stabbing sound sounded, drawing everyone's attention. When the duo turned to check, they were shocked to see a shadowy blade stabbed through the baddie. The culprit for his backstab was the Burnt Man, the second form of the Burning Man. The system described it as a being made of smoke, capable of growing and shrinking as it wished. Currently, its highest skill level was 1. The room instantly turned chaotic with Morgane's ambush. The duo hadn't expected it to happen, so they were caught completely off guard. Unfortunately for them, the boss wasn't going to give them the time to adjust. It immediately shot out an attack aimed at Jeong. Jeong barely dodged the blow, narrowly saving his life. If he'd been late to open the second door, then he would have died for sure. His heart raced at the boss's absurd speed. How could it be that fast? Moreover, how was the attack still so powerful despite its crazy speed? It made no fucking sense. With how things were, Jeong suddenly smelled an intense stench of death. If he couldn't find an effective way to kill the boss bastard, then he would for sure die there. Worst part? He'd die in the company of the lizard bastard instead of a milfy mommy. What a trash way to go. Over at Lizard Mark, the dude chose the absolute worst time to get caught in his feels. He crouched before the dead Morgane, saying a bunch of sentimental nonsense to her. Well, technically, they weren't nonsense. In fact, they were actually pretty sweet. But come on, dude. Now isn't the time to say goodbye to bitches. Make some damn moves. The burnt man obviously wasn't going to let go of this opportunity. It swang at Lizard, going for a direct KO. Jeong saw this and immediately panicked. He shouted at Lizard to get his shit together. The baddie was already gone. Before he could convince the freak, the strike from B-Man landed, yeeting the absolute shit out of Morgane's corpse. As for Lizard, he'd narrowly escaped the attack, relying on some weird ass-pull move. The boss became more enraged after missing its attack. It decisively went all in, unleashing a flurry of strikes at Lizard. However, the ugly fool was still under the protection of plot armor, so he easily evaded the blows. As he ran, the scaly bastard took the chance to self-glaze a bit, flexing that he wouldn't die so easily. So what if the B-Man spanked his baddie? He'd make sure to get his revenge. In fact, his revenge arc would begin right now. He decisively lunged at the boss, his new skill on full display. Contrary to the lizard or salamander skills you might have expected, the fool actually had a cat skill, specifically, cat dance skill. The skill enabled fast and consecutive attacks and also buffed his physical abilities, so it wasn't that booty of a skill. Actually, it was pretty handy against the boss because it perfectly countered its incorporeal form. Every swing of Lizard's claws did fatal damage to the boss, dispersing its body bit by bit. Jeong saw this and immediately developed a battle strategy against the boss. If they could bombard it with quick, conservative attacks, then there was a chance they could win this fight easily. However, as expected of L.A.G, shit wouldn't go so easily. The boss suddenly switched up its fighting style, catching the duo off guard. Lizard was the first to feel this change, with a stab aimed at his head. Luckily, the weird fool was as nimble as a cat, allowing him to narrowly dodge the assault. Following his backflip, Lizard landed on the labyrinth wall before shooting back at the boss. The two continued their intense tango as the homie Jeong watched on from the sidelines. After observing for a while, Jeong gathered enough information to confidently join the fight. He first activated a movement technique, allowing him to glide seamlessly across the battlefield. He then summoned his bone blade before morphing it into a glaive. With the new weapon in tow, Jeong unleashed a flurry of stabs on the boss, slowly dispersing its body. On the other side, Lizard also joined the offensive, trapping the fiend in a pincer attack. Under the duo's relentless barrage, the boss finally scattered, leaving behind a faint shadow of itself. Jeong eyed the thin shadow and immediately frowned. Under normal circumstances, this would have been the time to receive the mission clear notification. But since nothing happened, it was safe to assume L.A.G was back at it again. He immediately locked in, ready for whatever shit would pop off. And as expected, the boss suddenly underwent a bizarre transformation, scaring the shit out of the duo. They rapidly backpedaled, moving away from the cluster of darkness that was the boss. However, halfway through the retreat, Lizard suddenly lost his damn mind and instead charged at the boss. He shouted a bunch of war cry bullshit, but honestly, I stopped listening because I knew this motherfucker was cooked. Jeong also felt the same way, so he silently watched on from the sidelines. And true to our prediction, just as Lizard was about to strike the boss, a new change occurred, leaving the fool in a perilous situation. Jeong picked up on this and shouted a warning to Lizard. Unfortunately, it was too late, and the die was already cast. When Lizard's attack landed, his eyes involuntarily widened, and an overwhelming feeling of dread assaulted him. He hadn't felt any feedback from his strike, meaning he hadn't hit the boss, but opened himself up for a brutal counterattack instead. Obviously, the boss wouldn't let go of such a prime opportunity. It instantly extended its shadowy tentacles, wrapping Lizard up in a cocoon of darkness. The cocoon then constricted before it slowly and painfully squeezed Lizard to death. With one final ghastly cry, the weird fool burst open like a ripe tomato, sputtering his blood across the labyrinth floor. Following his death, the dark cocoon settled into an unnerving silence as Jeong continued to watch from the sidelines. However, different from before, his face was now tensed, showing just how troubled he felt. He cursed Lizard for his rashness, openly blaming him for his current predicament. Didn't he know anything about L.A.G? How could he make such an amateur move this late into the game? Truly pathetic. Just as he was cursing Lizard to high hell, a new change occurred, drawing his attention. The darkness from the burnt man was slowly entering Lizard's corpse, promising one hell of a shit day. After a bit of time and under Jeong's tensed gaze, the possessed lizard slowly rose up, standing grandly before Jeong. Jeong gazed somberly at Lizard's abyss-like eyes before silently cursing to himself. He'd known this shit would happen, because when has L.A.G ever liked him? But even still, this wasn't enough to douse his spirit. He instantly locked in, opening the third door from the get-go. The possessed lizard also responded in kind, roaring out a sonic attack. The might of the blast caught Jeong slightly off guard, forcing him to backpedal. He held on with all his might before finally regaining his ground. When the roar faded, Jeong couldn't help but reassess the fiend. The casual attack was so powerful, it made Dwayne's beast roar seem like kids' play. However, if this attack was already so strong, just how broken was the boss? Not to mention its near indestructibility. How was he supposed to kill this thing? He had absolutely no idea. But still, that didn't stop him from trying. If he couldn't figure it out, then he'd just have to beat its ass until a solution appeared. Sometimes the simplest solution is the best solution. Thinking so, he decisively raised his glaive, ready to clap some possessed cheeks. With zero hesitation, he let that thing fly, unleashing the might of Asgard on its smoky ass. Unfortunately, even this wasn't enough, as not even Poppy Odin could exorcise this stubborn bastard. He easily tanked that shit, smirking at Jeong soon after. Jeong saw the smirk and cursed L.A.G. If even that attack didn't work, then what did the game want him to do? Did he have to get up close and personal? Fine. If that's what it took, then he'd personally deliver a can of whoop-ass on the fool. He charged forward, swinging his sword for a decapitating slash. But just like all his previous attempts, the slash amounted to booty, as Lizard easily blocked it. Jeong's eyes widened at the feat. Just how strong was this bastard to be able to block a sword with his bare hands? What kind of cheat-like skill was this? Obviously, his doubts went unanswered, and all he got was a killer punch to the gut. The blow was so severe that Jeong coughed up a mouthful of blood before being sent flying like a broken kite. As he closed in on the labyrinth wall, Jeong finally regained his senses and realized the immense danger he was in. If he clashed head-on at his current speed, then the impact would do even more damage than Lizard's punch. Such a thing couldn't be allowed to happen, thus he wisely channeled his acrobat-type shit, pulling off a mid-flight somersault. Thanks to his quick thinking, Jeong safely landed on the labyrinth wall, dispersing most of the momentum. With the quick second of respite, he quickly assessed the situation before realizing the boss wasn't all that strong. Sure, its physical abilities were absurd, but it wasn't to the point he couldn't endure it. And since that was the case, he quickly developed immense confidence in facing it in direct combat. He immediately lunged forward, clocking the boss in the jaw. Lizard responded with a nasty cross before eating Jeong's uppercut soon after. He instantly counterattacked with an uppercut of his own before winding back for a strong punch. Jeong did the same as the two titans clashed fists. The force from the blow kicked both of them back, forcing both parties to backtrack. Jeong quickly stabilized his body before shooting a glance at Lizard. What he saw made his scalp itch, as the bastard wasn't injured at all. Even after all that shit, the fool was still smirking, clearly enjoying the brawl. In fact, if he had to compare, he'd probably say he'd lost out on that exchange, with the only consolation being he'd managed to snatch Lizard's soul during the chaos. However, other than that, the situation wasn't looking too good, and if he couldn't turn things around, then he'd definitely die there. But even if he knew that, what could he possibly do? His stamina was already dangerously low, and the toll for using the third limitation door was already creeping in. If he wasn't careful, he might just die from the backlash before falling prey to the boss. With so many unfavorable factors, Jeong contemplated betting it all on madness. Since things had developed to that point, he might as well go mad and bring the bastard down with him. Unfortunately, even if he was suicidal, the madness skill was still on cooldown until his stamina recovered. If he wanted to use it, then he'd have to stall for 20 minutes at least. Jeong cursed at his dire circumstances but was helpless all the same. No matter how he thought about it, his only option was to fight, and fight some more. If he was lucky, then he might just fight his way to victory, or maybe a glorious death. In any case, his best move was to lock in and let them hooks fly. As he thought to this point, Jeong couldn't help but miss his crew. If they had been there, he wouldn't be going through this shit. At the very least, he might have used Dwayne as a meat shield as he escaped with his baddie Kara. What a fairy tale that would have been. Unfortunately, L.A.G wasn't a fairy tale, and Lizard wouldn't stay still and let him dream. He immediately lunged at him, forcing our boy to lock in. Jeong pushed the chaotic thoughts from his mind as he summoned his bone blade. Since things had gotten to this point, he might as well stab a bitch, and if even that isn't enough, he'd double down with a storm of lightning. He was really curious to see if the bastard was as indestructible as it seemed. Thus, Lizard was sent flying from the blow as Jeong watched on expectantly. However, after a quick glance, his face couldn't help but darken. The fool still had no injuries, and Jeong's attack seemed to be futile. He'd purposely aimed for the heart, but to think even that didn't work. Well, no shit. Did he forget the fool was already dead? Jeong watched on gravely before his expression suddenly changed. After careful observation, he realized that there was indeed a noteworthy change in Lizard's body. The black, smoky substance was slowly seeping from the stab wound. Not only that, the cocky fucker who'd been smirking the entire time was now showing a solemn and wary face. Jeong thought about it before coming to a realization. It seemed the boss's true motive for possessing Lizard was to get a meat shield to protect its weaker, smoky self. If that was true, then destroying the meat shield would enable him to kill the smoky bastard as well. After arriving at this conclusion, Jeong immediately set off to test it out. He first summoned his bone blade before morphing it into a serrated sword. If his guess was correct, then this would be the most efficient weapon to handle that possessed fool, since the edges would deal the most damage to the flesh. And to add a bit of spice to the mix, he summoned another serrated sword, dual-wielding them things. With that out of the way, Jeong immediately charged at the boss, ready to end this shit. He first opened with a right swing, aiming for a decapitating slash. However, Lizard easily dodged that shit, bending his back in unnatural arches. This move surprised Jeong, who hadn't expected the fiend to be that nimble. For a split second, he wondered if Lizard could teach that move to Kara, because who wouldn't want a baddie with a killer arch? However, he was soon pulled back to reality as a nasty punch aimed for his jaw. Jeong saw this and grit his teeth. Damn it, just how many L's was he going to take? Even if he was a patient Chad, this was still some bullshit. Jeong read the attack and narrowly dodged to the side. However, from that close shave with death, he knew this ugly, lizard-arched-back motherfucker couldn't be underestimated. If he wanted to actually survive this battle, then he had to throw all caution to the wind. Fuck defense. He was going all in with offense. He slashed at the fiend, sawing through its flesh with his serrated blade. When that wasn't enough, he headbutted the fool, forcing Lizard to stumble back. Lizard was taken aback by the sudden barrage. For a split second, he failed to react, causing him to take severe damage. Unfortunately for it, that split second was all Jeong needed to press the attack. He charged at the fiend, unleashing a flurry of slashes on it. Although each slash didn't do much damage, they quickly added up, forcing Lizard into a passive state. Jeong capitalized on this and doubled the assault, hoping to chip away at its life. But Lizard read through his intentions and counterattacked, grabbing and breaking Jeong's sword. Without the sword, Jeong immediately backpedaled. He'd be a fool if he insisted on attacking. Attacking such a foe without a weapon was pure lunacy. It'd be a miracle if he didn't get his ass clapped. Pause. Jeong ignored the narrator's sussy comment as he focused on the fiend. Although the ass clap made him think of Tai Min, he knew now wasn't the time for that shit. Ever since he dealt that sweet combo damage to the B-man, its aura had suddenly changed, almost as if it was cornered and desperate. Well, whatever the bastard had in store, Jeong was confident he could handle it somehow, so he dared the boss to come at him. Lizard said cool and spawned in front of Jeong, his fist already on his face. It moved with such speed that Jeong couldn't react, only letting out a soft bitchy whimper to express his shock. However, despite all that, he was still him, so he instinctively leaned forward, hoping to block with the toughest bone in the body. Obviously that didn't work out, and Jeong was yeeted to high heaven. In fact, the blow was so bad that Jeong was sent flying like a slapped hoe, crashing pathetically against the labyrinth wall. When he finally hit the ground, he couldn't help but look at the boss in shock. Where the fuck had all that strength come from? Had it been holding back this entire time? And if so, then this was truly some bullshit. If he compared his current strength to his past lives, then he'd say he had enough strength to rival the past him when he was on the 9th or maybe even 10th basement floor. That is to say, he was overpowered as fuck, but even so, this lizard bastard still sent him flying. How was that possible? Why was a boss this strong camping on the 6th floor? It made no sense. When he thought about it, Jeong inevitably doubted L.A.G. Could it be that the B-man was a trap by the game? Something that wasn't meant to be killed, just like the masked lion? Because if so, then it would make more sense. Unfortunately, he didn't have enough information to deduce the truth, and it wasn't like Lizard would idle around as he figured shit out. No matter the case, he still had to move. Only then would he have a slim chance to escape. He shakily stood up, only to collapse to his knees soon after. Coupled with his blurry vision and stinging head, Jeong realized his injuries were more severe than he'd initially thought. In fact, it was so bad that he couldn't control his body, essentially reduced to a sitting duck for the bee-man. Jeong grit his teeth and tried again, but no matter what he did, he still ended up on his knees, completely helpless. It was then that the sultry voice of death whispered into his ear. He was going to die. The next attack would kill him for sure. Jeong felt immense bitterness at the thought. Was this how he'd die? After everything he'd been through? Was he really going to die on his knees like a bitch, stepped on by this lizard bastard? Hell no. He'd be damned if he let that happen. Ever since the beginning, the system had promised a reward if the boss was killed. That meant it was definitely possible to clap this fool. If so, then why was he hesitating? Who better than him, Jeong the Big Poppy Hyeok, the MILF Slayer Hyeok, and the Maiden Conqueror Hyeok, could kill it? He immediately locked in, blocking Lizard's stomp with his arms. Through gritted teeth, he vowed to hold on, determined to fight until his last breath. Lizard stomped even harder at his defiance, resigned to extinguish that spark of rebellion in his eyes. Unbeknownst to them, the clash caused cracks on the floor, and the damage was only spreading as the fight continued. Before they could react, the ground suddenly collapsed, dragging both of them to the pits of hell. Well, maybe not hell, but it was still hella dark, so their fates weren't looking too good. After falling through the darkness for seemingly an eternity, Jeong suddenly crashed into a rocky desert, kicking up a dust storm from his pathetic landing. When the dust finally settled, the ragged silhouette of our boy became visible, and it was clear he'd seen better days. But even still, Jeong was happy he'd survived, and he thanked the sand for cushioning his fall. With that out of the way, he glanced around the room, marveled that such a place existed on the 6th basement floor. Unfortunately, his joy didn't last long as he soon caught a glimpse of Lizard. Of course the bastard had survived. This wouldn't be Lag if he didn't. Jeong grit his teeth as he cursed the resilient fucker. Why couldn't it fall on a rock or something? Why couldn't his luck be good for once? Well, to hell with it. If the fiend wanted smoke, then he'd give him smoke. Coincidentally, his butt had been itching lately, and he felt it was about time he pulled an ability out of his ass. He swiftly called upon his lightning, morphing it into a ball of carnage. With that as the base, he channeled more and more power to it, causing the lightning ball to balloon up in an instant. When the ball reached its limit, Jeong condensed it, forcing it to shrink to a regular-sized Chidori. Of course, this wasn't the real Chidori, but a Temu knockoff by the maidenless author. Jeong stared at the lightning ball as he reaffirmed his resolve. Although this was an impromptu ass pull, he still knew he couldn't be careless handling such a concentrated ball of energy. One wrong move, and it'd be off to Lag heaven for him. However, what choice did he have? If he didn't risk it, he would die for sure. Thus, he resolutely pushed the ball into his chest, allowing the lightning to run rampant in his body. Bolts of lightning streaked from his chest, bathing the surroundings in a storm of lightning. When the storm finally stopped, Jeong's silhouette became visible, and so did his new transformation. Official debut. Lightning Man just joined the fray. If you're curious about where the ability came from, just forget about it. The author explained with some bullshit, but I know ass-pull plot armor when I see it. Just forget it. It'll be simpler for everyone if you do. Over at Jeong, he mad-dogged Lizard, his battle lust brimming. With so much power coursing through him, he couldn't wait to clap some reptilian cheeks. He stared down the fiend, resolved not to die just yet. No matter the cost, he'd survive this hell, and hopefully, make it out with his crew. With his mind made up, Jeong locked all the fuck in. He channeled the lightning through his body, preparing for a devastating counterattack. The lightning flowed from his happy feet to his head through his chatty body. Buffed by the ass-pull technique, Maiden Hunter Jeong bravely faced off against Lizard, his intent to battle obvious. Lizard rose to the challenge, glaring back at Jeong. It then locked in before shooting straight at Jeong. Jeong was slightly startled by the attack, but he didn't lose his cool. He simply gathered his energy before zeroing in on Lizard. Thanks to his supercharged body, he could now follow the fiend's movements. All those absurdly fast attacks were mere trash in his eyes, thus he easily swatted Lizard to the side, bitch-slapping the shit out of the fool. Lizard was shocked by the sudden change, clearly confused by Jeong Bastard's power-up. However, despite the shock, it was still a boss. How could it falter because of a simple yeeting? It swiftly locked back in, prepared another attack, and lunged back at Jeong. Jeong read the attack and prepared a counter of his own. He crouched down before shooting at Lizard with a nasty Superman punch. Both titans clashed midway, causing a deafening explosion to sound. The force from the impact was so powerful that the surrounding space was sent into disarray, dust and wind clouds billowing about. Obviously, Lizard fell short in the exchange, causing it to fall back. In that short exchange, its arm was essentially crippled, leaving it in a perilous situation. Jeong noticed this and immediately prepared a counterattack. He wouldn't be the top dog if he didn't capitalize on such opportunities. Thus, he decisively shot at Lizard, ready to kick the fucker while he was down. Well, more like punch a fucker, based on the knuckled sandwich he just shoved into its face. Lizard quickly found itself in a perilous situation, cornered on all sides by the slayer Jeong. It shot through the air, obviously still reeling from the blow. Meanwhile, Jeong pressed the attack, gliding through the air like a Greek god. Without mercy, he delivered another savage punch, yeeting Lizard away like a broken kite. Capitalizing on this opening, Jeong shot forward again, recreating the iconic punch scene from Man of Steel. Just like the Chad Cal waifu stealer L, he clocked the shit out of Lizard, sending it flying like a rag doll. After the first punch came the second, then the third, and soon Lizard became a training dummy, punched to high hell for Jeong's satisfaction. When he finally saw an opening in Lizard's guard, Jeong rushed for it, delivering a nasty slam on the pitiful fool. Due to the absurd force, Lizard shot down like a comet, crashing pitifully on the desert floor. However, our boy wasn't done. He prepared another attack, this time going for a Thor-type shit, lightning punch. Buffed by the king of Asgard, Jeong crashed into Lizard, his fist digging deep into its gut. After the first punch came a second attack, a storm of lightning rampaging through Lizard's body. Jeong finally had enough and backpedaled. However, he soon jumped back in and resumed his offensive. Like a crazed beast, he let them fists fly, making sure the fiend was dead for good. After a session of pure carnage, he reluctantly fell back, leaving the mangled corpse for the desert to devour. Jeong eyed his handiwork in satisfaction, but deep down, he still felt like shit. He already knew the backlash would be strong, but he'd never imagined it would be this severe. In fact, it was so bad that his body was useless, drained of energy to even lift a finger. Well, even if that was the case, he was still glad he went through with it. Because of the OP move, he'd managed to get rid of the boss, and that was a worthwhile trade in his books. Just as he was glazing himself, a sudden change occurred before him, catching him completely off guard. Lizard, the same fool that had its body torn to bits, was slowly rising, an action that greatly shocked Jeong. He wondered how the fool was still alive, especially since he'd personally torn it to shreds. Unfortunately, the boss wouldn't answer, and it wasn't like his denial would change anything. Thus, he swiftly locked in, glaring daggers at the approaching Lizard. Lizard calmly walked toward Jeong, causing the latter to frown intensely. Because of the backlash, his body was still immobilized, so he couldn't muster a resistance even if he wanted to. He stared gravely at Lizard, powerless to stop his demise. Lizard inched closer to Jeong, its arm raised to attack. Because of Jeong's condition, the bastard was essentially powerless, a fat fish on the chopping board. Without giving the fish any chance to counterattack, Lizard punched forward, aiming for Jeong's heart. Jeong's face instantly paled, dreading that his end had finally come. But contrary to his expectations, Lizard suddenly stopped, its fist passing harmlessly through Jeong's body. Jeong stared in surprise at the slowly dissipating bee-man, puzzled as to what was going on. Even if it was plot armor, wasn't this a bit too much? He shot a questioning glance at Not, but the chatty narrator told him to just go with it. Why was he questioning blessings? Who knows? Maybe his next armor would be some bitches, and he'd finally get himself some waifus. Until then, he should pay attention to the system notification, as it had some news to deliver. It stated that the additional mission for room B64 had been completed, and the owner of the labyrinth had been killed. As things stood, only one mission was left, and that was to escape that hell. Jeong locked all the fuck in, knowing the true challenge had just begun. Escape aside, his main priority was to find his crew and, more importantly, reunite with his baddie. Hopefully this time, the author would have some mercy and his baddie would still be alive, because otherwise, fuck that dude. As he was thinking of his future moves, the mist that was formerly the B-Man fully dissipated, leaving behind a brand new shade of souls. I'm colorblind as fuck, so I won't even attempt identifying the color. However, the important thing to note is that B-Man was hella strong, so the soul it left behind must be juicy as well. Jeong smiled at the loot, but the surprises didn't end there. Just as it had promised, a gift was granted by the system for the courageous players who killed the owner of the labyrinth. For our boy, the gift manifested as a swirling black vortex which promptly shot at him. Just as Jeong was beginning to freak out and fear for his body being probed by some black misty tentacles, the mist suddenly changed direction and settled on his right arm. Jeong sighed in relief before shifting his focus to his right arm. On it was the system's gift, which it described as the gray body skill. The skill basically allowed for partial transformation, and the effect extended to skills as well. Although Jeong felt uneasy about it, he still accepted the skill, because what else could he do? On top of that, it was his experience that skills and effects were generally harmless to the users, so that at least gave him some confidence. However, just because that was the case didn't mean it was still true. This was L.A.G after all, so he wouldn't be surprised if the game switched things up just to mess with him. He decided to test things out. Only then would he be truly secure. The first test involved the Bone Blade, which transformed from an equipment skill into a passive skill. Due to the change, the skill became permanently his, and its ease of use increased drastically. He could now summon and morph the Bone Blade at will, making the skill more versatile and deadly. Unfortunately, with every upside, there's a downside, and in this case the Skeleton Soldier skill was permanently removed, canceling his access to it. Although it was a shame, Jeong quickly got over it because the next upgrade was just that great. The Skull King's face successfully upgraded to the Skull King passive skill. The skill served as a permanent buff, strengthening Jeong's bones to a ridiculous degree. And yes, I mean all the bones. From his arms, to his legs, and of course, his boner. Let's move on, shall we? Due to the buff, Jeong's defense had also strengthened significantly, increasing his chances of survival. And although I'm not sure, I believe he now has what it takes to fight evenly against Stepan, or at the very least not lose so pathetically. That in itself should tell you just how much he'd leveled up. However, Jeong still had a lot on his mind, which sucked the joy from the moment. He was really worried about the crew. Were they still alive? Did they manage to escape the labyrinth? He didn't know, and that uncertainty was driving him crazy. He thought about it for a while before sighing in defeat. There wasn't anything he could do. He just hoped they were alive, and that they'd reunite soon enough. Shaking the turbulent thoughts from his mind, Jeong looked around the space. He was still hella tired, so finding a place to hide was of utmost importance. Second to that was avoiding any conflict, as fighting in his current condition would just lead him to death. Thus, he shakily walked forward, nesting himself in a secluded spot amidst the desert rocks. When he settled down, his eyes drooped immediately, too tired to stay awake. Soon, his gentle snores sounded, serenading the calm desert. After an unknown period of time, Jeong finally stirred from his slumber, fully ready to re-embark on his journey. However, that's when he discovered an unforeseen problem. He had no idea where to go. All around him was an unfamiliar desert, so where the hell was he supposed to go? Left with no choice, Jeong picked a random direction and just walked. Whether he was right or not, he'd figure out later. For now, all he could do was move. After walking for hours, the intense heat of the desert finally got to him, and Jeong couldn't help but pant heavily. However, even though he was tired, he still continued walking, since stopping would only lead to his death. He knew for a fact there was an end to the desert, so he just kept walking, even though his efforts were proving more and more futile. Luckily, after an eternity of suffering, and just when he was about to collapse, things finally turned around, and Jeong finally saw some hope. Before him was a huge hole, or rather, quicksand, the only oddity in the otherwise monotonous desert. Jeong quickly identified it as the entrance to the next floor, as nothing else seemed to fit the description better. On top of that, he'd also run into such kinds of entrances in his past lives, so he was pretty sure this was the real deal. Probably. Wasting no time, Jeong swiftly took a deep breath before jumping into the quicksand. When he did, he thanked his lucky stars he'd taken the gamble, because this was indeed the correct entrance to the next floor. Beneath him was a giant hole, the kind you'd associate with typical entrances in L.A.G. And further down was a dim light, likely the light from the next floor. Jeong grew more brazen and further increased his falling speed. Soon, he tore through the ceiling, officially crashing into the next floor. When the dust settled, he was shocked to realize the ceiling was made of sand. As for how it stayed in place and didn't fall, he had no idea, and just chalked it up to L.A.G. being L.A.G. That aside, he also noticed another interesting detail. He wasn't the only one in the room. All around him were groups of people, each more tense than the last. For some strange reason, he was getting a really bad feeling about the room. Just as he was taking in the scene, a ninja baddie suddenly screamed, crying out for her beloved. However, no matter what she did, the homie still died, leaving her alone in the hellish game. The baddie's comrade called out to her, urging her to forget about him. Inasmuch as it sucked, the Chad was already gone, so crying about it wouldn't solve anything. Instead, he begged her to lock in, because if she didn't, then they would all die there. Jeong heard the bootleg assassin's creed and immediately became puzzled. He realized the Humpty Dumpty wasn't referring to him or the other group, so what the hell was going on? As he was still racking his brain for a solution, a gigantic explosion sounded behind him, scaring the shit out of him. Jeong swiftly turned to check, and what he saw terrified him. Throughout his experiences in L.A.G., this was the first time he felt justified to curse. And truly, L.A.G. was on some bullshit. Honestly, what the hell is this shit? Before him was a giant antlion with a fat ass. The system described it as basically immortal because the bastard wouldn't die even if it was killed. Obviously, Jeong had the same reaction as most of you right now. What the hell was that shit? First, it was ridiculously OP bosses, and now the boss was immortal? What was going on with L.A.G.? Unfortunately, he didn't have the time to curse at L.A.G. because the monster was there, and he had to lock in. Over at the main battlefield, the bootleg Assassin's Creed and Widow Baddie did their best to hold the creature back. Although their attacks were pure garbage, they still did a good enough job to buy time for the bronze and possibly bootleg Garcia mommy. Capitalizing on the opening they bought, she lunged at the thick ant, her bone blade drawn for a desperate attack. Jeong noticed the baddie and couldn't help but be pleasantly surprised. Not only was she a bootleg version of his lost boo Emma, top waifu Garcia, but she was also quite formidable, as shown by her courage to face the abominable monster head-on. Unfortunately, in L.A.G., courage and milfiness weren't enough to fell monsters. Strength was also needed. Just as he'd expected, the baddie's attack bounced off the creature's carapace, doing 0 damage. Forget about the big bastard. Even little insects have a thick exoskeleton, not to mention this undying fucker. So her attack failing was all but certain to Jeong. Back at the battlefield, Bronze Emma suddenly sensed an immense premonition of death and rapidly backpedaled. Luckily, she did so, as the antlion dove back into the ground immediately after. If she'd insisted on her attack, then she would have been dragged in as well, and that would have been an instant death sentence. After losing sight of the boss, the whole group grew frantic, and desperate cries rang out, which low-key surprised Jeong. He wondered why they were acting like that, but his question was soon answered by a sneak attack from the antlion. It turned out the creature was using the dense sand to pick them off one by one, and every dive into the ground signaled the death of another player. Currently, the unlucky bastard was the homie Vincent, who got torn in two, much to the group's horror. Jeong noticed this and frowned slightly. From his observation, he could deduce that both the players and the antlion had their own strategies. The players were probably trying a scheme to trap the creature, but that was obviously not going to work. That was because the boss had seen through their strategy and was using their own tactics to pick them off one by one. To fully trap it, the players had to be spread out, and the antlion was using that chance to deal with the players individually as opposed to dealing with them in a group. Just like in the current moment where the boss had its sights set on new prey, and the others couldn't rush in to help. Jeong watched as the fool panicked before being yeeted to high hell by the antlion. Just as he'd expected, the others didn't move to help. First, it went against their strategy, and second, who would be dumb enough to risk their lives to save others? It wasn't like they had enough of those to throw around. Thus, they all watched passively as the new prey died, clearly not intending to intervene. Well, all but one. The bootleg Garcia suddenly spawned beside the boss, delivering a nasty slash to its carapace. When the first slash didn't work, she immediately went to town on the bastard, landing a flurry of attacks on its back. Thanks to her relentless barrage, the carapace finally showed signs of collapsing, giving hope to the players. Unfortunately, this hope was short-lived, as the boss retaliated, charging forward to squash her against a looming boulder. Just as despair was sinking in, a comrade came to her rescue, bashing the boss and buying Bronze Baddie enough time to escape. Because of the timely assist, the bootleg Garcia got to live another day, and she sincerely thanked the player who low-key looked a bit like a thinner Dwayne. Or maybe Dwayne on crack, depending on how you look at it. Jeong chose that moment to finally join the fray. He expressed his willingness to help, so what did the group want the mighty him to do? Crackhead Dwayne replied that they needed help with the carapace. Without destroying that thing, they wouldn't be able to do shit to the boss. Bronze Garcia, who turns out to be Carly, added that they needed to make a hole in the carapace. Only then would they be able to finish it off with magic. Jeong doubted their idea but still went with it. Even though he knew killing an immortal being wasn't so easy, what other choice did he have? This was L.A.G. The missions had to be cleared even if he had to toot that ass to do so. Pause. Just as they were ironing out the plan, the boss suddenly attacked, forcing the group to disperse. They all skedaddled, all except Jeong, who stayed in place to farm some aura. Like the maiden slayer he was, Jeong stayed rooted in place, glaring at the boss with unmatched confidence. The boss responded to the challenge, doubled its speed, and rammed into him like Track-kun from those generic isekai stories. However, unlike those brain rot stories, our boy was genuinely him, so he easily dodged that shit, clinging to the wall with his Batman skill. Realizing the baddie Carly had her eyes set on him, Jeong decided to flex some more, lunging at the boss with unmasked ferocity. He first morphed his bone blade into a spear, perfect for poking a bastard with. The stab dug so deep that the boss couldn't help but shriek in pain, its immortality be damned. It instantly realized its perilous situation and opted to temporarily retreat into the sand. Obviously, the group wouldn't let this happen. The first to move was Crackhead Dwayne, who snorted a bump before clinging to the boss's leg. Thanks to his mysterious yet crystallized power-up, he managed to hold on to the boss, preventing it from retreating into the sand. Next was Assassin's Creed, who used his powers to stall for even more time. Although we don't get to see the visual manifestation of his power, I'm pretty sure he was really doing something. Otherwise, he wouldn't be bitching so much. He cried out to the group, urging them to hurry, as he wouldn't be able to hold it for long. First of all, that's what he said. Second of all, if you really think about it, 10 seconds is like a minute in dog time. So don't let her tell you shit, kings. Keep doing your thing. Jeong heard the narrator's nonsense ramblings and told not to focus. Now wasn't the time to get lost in his down-bad thoughts. Not understood, but honestly, the translators left him no other choice. What did they mean by the gap is too narrow and he needs to widen it? Wasn't this just asking to be teased? Especially with how pervy he was? In any case, he decided to lock in as well since Jeong still needed his narration for the upcoming battle. Speaking of Jeong, he decided to morph his bone blade once again. Since the spear wasn't thick enough to widen the gap, he opted for a broadsword, one wide enough to get the job done. However, as typical of L.A.G, things wouldn't go so smoothly. Just as he was preparing to land the final blow, the boss suddenly launched a counterattack, catching him completely off guard. In that short prelude to death, Jeong was forced to make a quick decision. Continue and risk death, or fall back and lose the golden opportunity. The choice was up to him. Jeong thought about it for only a second before saying, "Fuck that." There was no way in hell he'd risk his life so casually. He shouted at the group to help, otherwise he'd drop that shit and bounce. Tanned Garcia responded to his request, charging forward to reinforce him. On the opposite side, the grieving baddie, who I'll call White Widow from now on, also did the same, her face tinged with determination. Apart from them, there was also the bootleg Assassin's Creed, who for some reason became emo all of a sudden. I wonder where he got the black eyeliner and lipstick. In any case, the three did their best to reinforce Jeong. And yes, I said three, because Crackhead Dwayne stupidly got himself killed, stabbed through by the antlion's leg. Because of his foolish death, the antlion got enough leeway to retaliate, and it didn't hesitate to unleash its fury on Assassin's Creed. It yeeted him to the side like a rag doll, causing the poor emo to crash pathetically against the cave wall. Jeong saw this and immediately tensed up. With 2 players out of commission, things had suddenly become more difficult. As if proving him right, the antlion launched another sneak attack, this time attacking from a seemingly impossible angle. Jeong felt the threat and instantly dodged, narrowly escaping a quick kiss with death. If he'd hesitated for even a second, then he would have been another meat skewer on the battlefield, dying as pathetically as crackhead Dwayne. As he was thanking his lucky stars, Jeong noticed something that made his frown deepen. The wound on the boss's back was closing. In fact, the healing speed was so fast that Jeong couldn't believe just how much of a cheat it was. Was this what the system meant by it being immortal? Because if so, then he kinda got it now. However, just because he understood it didn't mean he'd let it happen. He'd be damned if he let lag have its way. Thus, he rapidly shot toward the boss, opening the first limitation door in the process. When he deemed that insufficient to deal with the boss, he added on the lightning effect, zapping the shit out of the boss. Bronze Baddie took that chance to attack as well, closing in on the boss with her bone blade. Thanks to Jeong's efforts, the boss's wound wasn't completely healed yet, so the baddie simply jammed her blade into it. After managing to keep the wound open, Carly turned to White Widow, urging her to make her move. White Widow didn't disappoint. Although she was still grieving her beloved, she knew a new hunk was already in sight, so it was time she forgot that loser. If she wanted to impress the MILF hunter Jeong, then she had to give it her all. She channeled her fire skill, shooting it at the boss soon after. As the flame flew, it morphed into a serpentine form, which quickly slithered into the boss's guts. Jeong and Carly immediately backpedaled, having no desire to get caught up in the ensuing explosions. As expected, the carnage was grand, making their choice to retreat the correct one. Devastating explosions rang out across the boss's body, reducing it to a fiery mess. Of course, the fiend didn't take this lying down. It immediately retaliated, swatting Carly away like a bug. The tanned baddie was caught completely off guard, causing her to black out immediately. With her neutralized, the battlefield instantly became more dangerous, adding more pressure to Jeong and White Widow. Speaking of Jeong, he finally made his move, closing the gap between himself and the fiend. His plan was simple. Kill the boss before Lag did the Lag thing and crashed out again. Coincidentally, the boss had its sights set on Carly and White Widow, which made his ambush all the better. On one hand, he could kill the biggest threat in the room, effectively saving his own life. And on the other hand, he could save 2 damsels in distress. Who knows how they'd reward him? Probably with some cheeks. In any case, the game plan was set. He had to clap some ant cakes. Jeong rushed forward before lunging at the bone blade on the boss's carapace. With that in his grasp, he instantly opened the 3rd limitation door, buffing his body for the havoc to come. Wasting no time, he channeled his lightning storm, bathing the fiend in its zapping brilliance. Due to the devastating attack, the boss's body fell apart like dominoes, crumbling to pieces under its relentless barrage. Soon, the fiend met its end, with its head popping off like a ripe tomato. Jeong saw this and wisely deactivated his limitation form. As much as he wanted to continue zapping this bastard, he knew such acts were pointless, and it would only put him in danger. Instead, he shifted his attention to the baddies, curious to know how they were doing. White Widow replied that they were good, thanks to him. However, since they were already talking, she might as well apologize in advance. Jeong eyed her curiously before asking what she was talking about. Why was she apologizing to him? Before he could get an answer, the sand suddenly attacked, wrapping around him like a cocoon. In that split second, an idea popped into his mind, and he immediately knew what was going on. This was a double cross. He'd been betrayed by these treacherous bitches. Damn. Jeong glanced behind him, and just as he'd expected, Assassin Creed was in on the backstab as well. Despite the seemingly dangerous situation he was in, he still remained relatively calm, as if this wasn't that big of a deal. With his calm demeanor still evident, he turned to face the baddies, inquiring if they were sure about this. Did they really want this smoke? White Widow replied that they didn't, but they had no other option. Tanned Garcia added that this was their strategy. For weaklings like them to survive in Lag, they had no choice but to hunt the strong. It was the only way to survive. He seemed strong, so he must know what kind of hell Lag is. Without taking such risks, how could they grow strong enough to survive? Jeong stared at the treacherous bitches but didn't say anything. Words were useless at that point. The baddies had already made their choice, so talking to them was just a waste of time. Carly noticed his patient acceptance and stepped forward. She believed this was Jeong's way of accepting his fate, probably because he knew he couldn't escape anyway. She gazed at the Chad sadly before sighing in resolution. It had to be done, even if she didn't want to. However, because he was a handsome and chatty poppy, she'd try to make it as painless as possible. There wasn't a need for such a fine specimen to suffer. With that in mind, she stabbed at Jeong, landing a direct hit on his chest. When the strike landed, Carly couldn't help but recoil in shock. What the hell was going on? The stab had done 0 damage to Jeong, even failing to pierce his skin. She suddenly had a bad premonition warning her to watch out. However, before she could react, Jeong flexed his lightning, easily breaking out of the sand cocoon. Now free, Jeong glared at the treacherous wenches. He let them know he didn't blame them, because he too had done the same in the past. And just like them, his ending was also quite tragic. But just because he understood them didn't mean he'd forgive them. They'd tried to kill him, so it was only right if he killed them as well. Saying so, Jeong opened the second door of limitation, ready for battle. As he was preparing to clap some cheeks, Emo Creed lunged from behind, attempting a sneak attack. He decisively launched his strongest attack, hoping to kill Jeong on the spot. Unfortunately for him, Jeong easily blocked that shit, using his lightning to counter the sand skill. Before the bastard could react, he responded with a left jab aimed at his flank. Creed noticed the attack and hurriedly erected a shield to block. Although the skill wouldn't hold for long, it was still enough for him to launch an attack of his own. However, Jeong read through this attack as well, blocking it with relative ease. This time, he opted for a forehead block, causing significant damage to Creed's arm. Just as he was about to finish him off, the ladies finally intervened with a blazing serpent hurling straight at him. Jeong ate the attack, forcing him to backpedal quite a bit. With the explosion's smoke still blocking his vision, Carly spawned behind him, attempting another sneak attack. However, this time Jeong was ready. He silently blocked the baddie's strike, stabbing into her gut in the process. Carly recoiled from the pain, nursing her wound as she backtracked from Jeong. Before he could press the attack, Creed appeared behind him again, going for a lethal blow. This time, Jeong had had enough and savagely grabbed him by the face. He lifted the fucker into the air before slamming him hard onto the ground. Ignoring Creed's pathetic chokes and sobs, he proceeded to zap the shit out of him, reducing his face to a burnt crisp. Done with that, he calmly turned to face the baddies. What would they do now? Would they fight or nah? Carly told him not to fuck with them. Ever since the beginning, they were ready to risk their lives. In fact, with Creed's death, that determination only strengthened, so there was nothing left to discuss. She told Jeong to come at them. They were ready to see this through till the end. With that, the duo charged at Jeong, causing a devastating explosion from their clash. A short while later, the room finally regained its calm, indicating the end of the battle. Left standing was the homie Jeong, who silently deactivated his limitation form. Although he'd just been through a battle, he didn't seem fazed at all, almost as if it was nothing. The only clue to the big clash was the blood on his blade and the dead corpses on the floor, both mangled to some degree. Jeong stared at the baddies, but he didn't seem bothered in the slightest. This was L.A.G. Such occurrences were common in that hell. If it had been the other way around, he was sure the wenches wouldn't have hesitated, so there was no need to feel sorry about it. He calmly collected their souls, using their power to level up his skills. He leveled up Tough Skin from level 20 to level 30, significantly increasing his defense. On top of that, when Tough Skin leveled up, it influenced the Bone Weapon skill, making it level up to Bone Equipment passive skill. With that out of the way, Jeong contemplated leveling up his Calm Breathing skill, but decided against it for now. Although the upgrade would make several skills easier to use, he didn't have enough souls to do so, so he put it aside for now. Besides, there were still several aspects of the Calm Breathing he hadn't tried out yet, like breath holding, so he wasn't in a rush to advance. Finished with his looting, Jeong turned to the nearby door, probably the entrance to the next floor. Wasting no time, he entered through the door, finding himself in an empty corridor. After walking for a bit, he finally reached his destination, the official entrance to the 7th floor. Jeong eyed the door before resolutely heading inside. What was there to fear anyway? When the door closed behind him, Jeong found himself in quite a pickle. If he were to describe it, he'd say something like doors, or rather, hella doors, judging by how many there were. All around him were identical doors, all clustered neatly along the room's walls. And the worst part? He had no idea what to do about it. Jeong took in the bizarre scene and couldn't help but feel a headache creeping up. Damn, this was going to be a bitch to handle. After some thought, Jeong decided to analyze the room some more. He quickly discovered that this was the first time he was seeing such a scene in L.A.G. But from his ample experience, it wasn't hard to deduce what was going on. Every door in the room led to a different space on the 6th floor. That is to say, every door led to a poor fool currently being clapped, choked, and possibly probed in a mission right now. Although it was hilarious to think about, especially if you imagine them getting the Thai-Min treatment, hella backshots, now wasn't the time for that, and the system wholeheartedly agreed. It immediately issued a prompt announcing that the mission was complete. Just as it had promised, juicy rewards were given to our boy, specifically 100 souls and the labyrinth key. It also emphasized that the rewards were given to him, Lee MILF Slayer Hyeok. Anyone who completed the mission first, or those who'd complete it later, would be rewarded at their own time. For those with big brains, I'm sure you must have already guessed what that means. If you haven't, then I guess we can only say God can't give you everything. You must be a Chad or baddie as compensation for falling short in that regard. However, if you're lacking both, then I'm sorry. You're cooked. Anyway, taunting aside, the system also gave more details about the labyrinth key. It was essentially a cheat item, one that can be used to open anything, and yes, I said anything, talk about being broken. The only downside was that the key could only be used 7 times, after which it would be destroyed. But even still, it was a great reward. Moving on, Jeong quickly stored the key. When he did, a hidden compartment in the floor opened up, offering an exit to the room. Jeong immediately walked over. He realized that it was a hole, a bottomless hole. In fact, despite his owl eyes, he still couldn't pierce the darkness and see the bottom. On top of that, a cold, ghastly wind blew in the hole, making it even more ominous. Jeong thought about it for a second, debating whether he should really go down such a spooky hole. However, after much thought, he instantly jumped into the hole. Why, you might ask? Well, first, he's not a bitch. And second, if it's a matter of bottomless hose, sorry, I meant holes, then he has enough experience with your trashy ex. Why would he be afraid of something like this? He swiftly dove down the shaft, recreating the horrible Temu flying CGI. Halfway through the fall, Jeong's mind couldn't help but wander. He recalled his past regressions and noted that the 7th floor was where he died the most. In fact, it wasn't an exaggeration to say that his cheeks got polished the most on the 7th floor than everywhere else in L.A.G. Although he doesn't go into much detail about it, the slight tremble in his body told us everything we needed to know. This motherfucker is cooked. Deciding to ignore the dread for now, Jeong immediately locked in. He first glided down the walls, reducing his speed by a lot. When he was satisfied, he leaped off the wall, landing gracefully on the ground. Just like that, Jeong had arrived at his destination, and the system also stated as much. It issued a prompt welcoming the MILF synthesizer to the 7th floor. Jeong ignored the prompt and stared forward in shock. Before him was a silhouette he'd never thought he'd run into here. Who else could it be but the main unit Dwayne? Forget the budget, Temu, crackhead version from before. This one was the real deal, including his CHADY aura. Jeong instantly called out to him, drawing Dwayne from his banter. When the unit realized it was Jeong calling, his face couldn't help but brighten. He shouted Jeong's name in response, running to him like a lost maiden. Just when I thought the duo were about to take us back to Brokeback Mountain, Jeong reached out his hand and told Dwayne to hold it. This wasn't that kind of video. If he really wanted that kind of action, then he should at least start by buying Terry Crews bathwater. Before that, he should keep it PG for the Chads. Ignoring Not's wild banter, Jeong turned his attention to the other figure in the room. He identified him as someone he'd known in his past life, but that in itself wasn't a good thing. To be able to make an impression on a regressor in a hellish place like L.A.G., the individual had to be famous or infamous, and for this bastard it was the latter. Jeong recalled meeting him, and his impression was that the dude was batshit crazy. In fact, he was so insane that Jeong had to act personally and kill his ass. Pause. In any case, this wasn't a good development. However, after thinking about it more, Jeong realized that might not necessarily be the case. Both Stepan and Maytal had changed in this regression, so who's to say this crazy bastard hadn't as well? For now, he opted to play it safe and keep an eye on him. Done with that, Jeong gazed around the room, clearly searching for someone. When his search proved futile, he directly asked Dwayne where Kara was. Why hadn't she come to welcome her poppy? Dwayne's face instantly fell with the question. He hesitantly replied that he didn't know either. They'd been separated on the last floor. Jeong's eyes widened in shock. What did he mean? Dwayne explained that after he'd left, a scary bastard ambushed them, forcing them into the lightning cloud. Although they tried to fight back, all their attacks didn't do shit, leaving them in a perilous situation. Cornered and with no other choice, he'd drawn the fiend's aggro, hoping to buy time for Kara to escape. Luckily, that part of the plan worked, and the fiend chased after him. Jeong immediately asked how he'd survived. If their attacks really did no damage to the creature, then how did he survive? Dwayne replied that he was just as clueless as he was. After drawing the creature away, he'd run like crazy. During the frantic escape, he'd occasionally turn and let loose his beast roar, buying himself more time. After a series of back and forths and the obvious close shaves, the bastard suddenly stopped, retreating on his own accord. When he confirmed he was safe, he hurried back to where he'd left Kara, but found she wasn't there anymore. He had no idea where she was currently. Jeong heard his recount and sighed softly. That wasn't necessarily a bad thing. In L.A.G, not finding a corpse can be considered a good outcome. Who knows? Maybe the baddie was out there somewhere waiting for them to rescue her. Just as he was contemplating his next move, the crazy bastard joined the banter, asking to be introduced. He was Norman Miles, and apart from his absurd highest skill level, his other stat was pure booty. Seriously, what the hell are you supposed to do with prickly skin? Was this a troll from L.A.G or what? Dwayne snapped to his senses and introduced the two. Since names were already shown by the system, he didn't need to dwell too much on that. Instead, he focused on how he'd met each party. For Norman, he explained that he'd run into him while looking for Kara. He expressed that Norman was a chill guy, and their teamwork was great. That's how they managed to survive until now. For Jeong, he didn't say much, but we can all guess what he would have said. Certified Poppy, Supreme MILF Slayer, and of course, he was him. It's not that difficult to describe our boy. If it wasn't for the author hating on him and the mommies in the story, then that list might have been longer. Probably without the chairman of the Virgin Association tag. In any case, let's shift back to the story and forget Jeong's maidenless life. After the introduction, it was time to select a door to challenge. With so many options, both Dwayne and Norman were quite stumped. Jeong, however, had other things in mind. He was certain this was the same trial as his past regressions, which also meant they were all the way fucked. But obviously, he wouldn't tell the duo that. Making them panic wasn't a smart move. Just as he was about to voice his opinion, Norman beat him to it and suggested taking door B755. Dwayne asked why that door specifically, but Norman shrugged it off, saying it was just a hunch. Obviously, Dwayne wasn't convinced by this, so he turned to face Jeong. What did he think? Jeong replied that it didn't matter. It would be the same in the end anyway. Inwardly, he mused about his experiences in L.A.G and the things that left the deepest impressions on him. One of them, unfortunately, was the 7th floor and the 7 doors it contained. It was always the same, and obviously the horrors were equally as constant. He explained to the duo that the doors were connected, and the goal of the room was to clear all the doors. Thus, it didn't matter what door they chose because they would enter all of them anyway. Norman asked how he knew that, and Jeong replied that it was his private attribute, not giving any details after that. Norman quickly got the hint and stopped prying. Instead, he asked Jeong what they should do. Jeong replied that they'd enter the doors, but in order. His explanation was that the doors had different difficulties, so it was best to tackle them from the easiest to the hardest. That way they'll have more leeway in the fights. The duo quickly agreed. It wasn't like they had any better ideas anyway. Thus, the trio promptly entered their first door, B711. What greeted them was a surreal scene, a room covered in calming blue, an obvious oddity in the hell that was L.A.G. If it wasn't for their rich experience, they might have fallen for the trap and assumed they were safe. Luckily, they weren't that naive, and the system prompt also helped them snap out of that foolish mindset. It explained the details of the room, but it's mostly everything Jeong had said, so don't worry about it. The only new info was the rewards, and the system promised quite the haul. First was 200 souls, next was an equipment exchange coin, and finally was a random skill exchange coin. It went without saying that the system was quite generous this time, which could only mean the room was about to violate our boys in all the wrong ways. Major pause. Apart from the main mission, the room also had a side mission, specifically to defeat the boss in every room. If they did that, then they'd get an additional reward. The clueless duo read through the prompts and commented indifferently. They deemed the mission quite simple, provided they were lucky and didn't fuck up. Jeong didn't reply, almost as if he couldn't be bothered with their naive words. Just as the duo were about to ask him what's up and where the boss was, a summoning circle suddenly shone from up ahead, drawing their attention. From the circle, aqua blobs of water slowly coalesced, obviously shaping into a new terror. Jeong's face instantly became solemn. He told the Chads to lock in because shit was finally about to go down. True to his prediction, the coalesced water slowly started to take form. Much to the trio's shock, the water first morphed into a wicked beard before completing the body of the dreaded boss. From an outward appearance, it wasn't that menacing. Just the typical forms we've grown to expect in L.A.G. In fact, with that potbelly and literal dicklessness, I'd say this is the sloppiest and saddest boss design I've seen in L.A.G. so far. And it's not just me thinking so, even the system threw shots at the fool, further emphasizing its L. It introduced him as Laggard the Dickless. Okay, maybe just Laggard. I added the dickless part myself. Anyway, its public attribute described it as extremely lazy, though not slow in the slightest. Currently, its highest skill level was 45. At first, I was puzzled as to why the fool was catching so many strays. I mean, being ugly and dickless was already bad enough, so why did the system have to call him lazy? But then I saw his nose, and I gotta say, this motherfucker deserves it. Just what in the eye show speed is that? Jeong also saw the beast, and his expression turned serious. However, contrary to my wilding thoughts, his attention was on something else. Laggard, this willyless fool, was different from his past regressions. And as a consequence, he had no idea how to deal with the pot-bellied, broad-nosed freak. As he was contemplating his next actions, the oblivious duo called out to him, asking what they should do next. Jeong replied that he had no idea. It wasn't like he knew everything. Norman glanced at him suspiciously. What did he mean he didn't know? Didn't his private attribute tell him? Or was it that the info he received wasn't as detailed as he'd initially believed? Well, if that was the case, then his attribute balance was pure garbage. The demerits of only having 2 active skills couldn't balance out the merits of receiving occasional info about the rooms. The balance was just off, and if he were to be honest, he'd probably say L.A.G. screwed him over. However, despite believing so, Norman still felt something wasn't right. He highly believed Jeong was hiding something. Otherwise, it wouldn't make sense. The only concern was, did Dwayne know about this, or had he been successfully fooled by Jeong as well? If it was the latter, then he should immediately abandon this group, because there was no way he'd trust his life to a liar and a fool. Shelving his doubts for now, Norman noticed another bizarre scene. Laggard seemed to be rooted in place. Even with enemies before it, the fool still didn't budge, a complete opposite to the monsters they'd run into so far. Jeong thought about it before instructing the duo to approach it. If Laggard didn't want to move, then they'd just go to him. Thus, the trio walked forward, decisive in their steps. Halfway through the walk, the fiend still stared at them passively, almost as if it had no intentions to respond. However, when they crossed the 3/4 mark, it finally lost its cool and whispered to them. It called them troublesome. Much to the trio's puzzlement, the boss proceeded to go on a long rant, explaining how troublesome it was. They were troublesome, the room was troublesome, and even L.A.G. was troublesome. If only he could melt and disappear, how great would that be? Why did his life have to be so troublesome? As he was complaining his guts out, he suddenly realized that even thinking about it was troublesome. Not only that, talking about it was even more troublesome. Then what should he do? It was simple. He'd just stop talking and thinking. That way, it would be less troublesome. If you haven't noticed already, Laggard has a tendency of finding things troublesome. It was hinted at on his character profile, and I guess this is the author's way of expressing his extreme laziness. Anyway, since it had decided to stop thinking and talking, Laggard settled for observing once again. He neither talked nor moved, almost as if he'd become a statue. When the trio noticed his absurd actions, they couldn't help but wonder what was up with the weirdo. Did it truly intend to stay still and do nothing? What kind of bullshit was that? But that aside, there was something else more pressing. So the weird boss would have to wait. They realized that the door exiting the room had disappeared, almost as if Lag was telling them they had to kill Laggard. But if so, how were they supposed to fight such a weird boss? Norman stepped forward, insisting that he had an idea. If it was just a matter of eliciting a reaction out of the fiend, then he had the best strategy. In his hand coalesced an orb of poison, which he swiftly yeeted toward Laggard. The orb struck true, causing the bastard's head to fling backward. When it did, Laggard's belly protruded forward, and I gotta say, this motherfucker is indeed ugly. However, judging by the thighs, at least we know he didn't skip leg day. Those thrusts must be hella mighty. Ahem. Jokes aside, the camera zoomed in on Laggard, showing the fate of the boss. Just as we'd expected, he easily tanked that shit, finding the attack more troublesome than deadly. Although half his face had melted off and it was supposed to be painful, the bastard couldn't be bothered to feel any of it. He was just too lazy to feel pain. Norman stared at the boss incredulously. Was this bastard for real? Was it still being lazy even after half its face was melted off? What kind of logic was that? Dwayne chimed in, expressing his doubts as well. Surely there had to be a limit to this absurdity. Or was it that the boss couldn't feel pain? Jeong corrected him, emphasizing what I had said earlier. The fool was just too lazy to feel pain. Since it was too troublesome to do so, he might as well cut off those useless senses. Although he'd said that, he couldn't help but wonder where the limit lay. Would Laggard still continue as usual if he attacked it? Well, there was only one way to find out. He swiftly channeled his electric powers, ready to blast the fiend. As for the fiend in question, it continued mumbling under its breath, complaining that it was such a pain. It was troublesome to fight, troublesome to think and talk, troublesome to kill, and even troublesome to have thoughts of killing someone. It was all too troublesome. But what should it do? It indeed hated feeling pain. So what should it do now that acting to stop that pain was also troublesome? It yelled out in despair, a tinge of confusion laced in its voice. When the voice sounded, it quickly morphed into a sonic attack, crashing into the trio. They immediately covered their ears, but even that wasn't enough to protect them fully. They felt their brains rattle, and Dwayne couldn't help but curse Laggard. If it found everything troublesome, then why was he attacking so viciously? He should have known it wasn't wise to trust the words of a big-nosed lunatic. Just as the trio were braving through the attack, Laggard suddenly smirked, seemingly coming to a realization. When Jeong saw that smirk, his danger senses flared, and his heart couldn't help but tighten. His instincts were warning him that something catastrophic was about to happen. Laggard, who was obviously the cause of this feeling, suddenly went dead silent before gazing up at the ceiling. He'd realized that his conundrum wasn't that hard to fix. If he found it too troublesome to think and do other things, then he could simply create another head to do all that for him. With that in mind, he calmly conjured another water blob, letting it float above him. From the blob dropped orbs of water, one of which landed on his head. Jeong, who was watching from the sidelines, said, "Fuck that," and immediately took action. Would he really be foolish enough to let the enemy cook while he watched? Nah, fuck that. He zapped that fool, drowning him in a torrent of lightning. Contrary to his expectations, Laggard easily tanked that shit, finding zero challenge in the endeavor. When he recovered, he shifted his gaze to the bewildered Jeong, shooting him a deadly glare. With a bone-chilling voice, he told the unit to wait for him. Once he got his second head, he'd make sure to properly polish his ass. Pause. Jeong heard the threat and trembled slightly. Since when did his delicate ass come under such threat in Lag? Well, forget it. Laggard was making his move, so now wasn't the time to think about it anyway. He immediately locked in, shifting his focus to the floating blobs in the air. However, to his shock, the blobs didn't just manifest in the air. They also spawned on the walls, effectively trapping them in a pincer attack. The clueless duo also picked up on this fact. Although they were dense, it didn't take a genius to know that something was definitely wrong. They quickly entered their fighting stances, but who knew if that would truly protect them from such an attack? Over at Laggard, he continued to mumble under his breath, calling everything troublesome. When the insanity peaked, he let loose his attack, blanketing the whole room with his blobs. Jeong, who was ready for an attack, couldn't help but curse. Why did it have to be an AoE attack of all things? How was he supposed to deal with this shit? Fuck. Although complaining felt great in the moment, he knew he couldn't afford to waste any more time. Thus, he immediately called for the duo to watch out, all whilst entering his limitation form. Thanks to the speed buff of the second door, time seemed to slow down around him, and Jeong could finally react to the harrowing attack. He first let it draw in before bitch-slapping the shit out of the blue orb, sending it flying like a kite. However, despite the CHADY performance, that was but a single orb, whilst the room was covered in them. If he didn't lock in, then he might just die there. Luckily, this was the maiden harvester we were talking about, so of course he'd have his own ways to survive. He swiftly channeled his inner Bruce Lee, unleashing his own version of the 100-type Guanyin Bodhisattva. Thanks to Netero's godly technique, he managed to weather the first wave of attacks. But that's where his luck ended. The subsequent attacks became even more dire, and Jeong once again found himself in a perilous situation. To the side was Dwayne, who was also facing his fair share of difficulties. Although he didn't have Jeong's cheat-like limitation skill, he was still hella sturdy, so he could endure the attacks, for now. Norman, however, wasn't faring so great. Without Jeong's limitation and Dwayne's sturdiness, he was relying on his own body to tank the attacks and, well, let's just say he was failing spectacularly. Even though the barrage had just begun, he was already at his limit, and if something wasn't done, he would for sure be the first to fall. When he realized that, he shot a pleading glance at Jeong and Dwayne, obviously asking for some help. Unluckily for the fool, Jeong and Dwayne were also going through it, with no room to intervene in his battlefield. They were fully concentrated on staying alive, so how could they drop everything and save his ass? Norman realized this and grit his teeth. It seemed he'd have to rely on himself this time. Whether he survived or was crushed to death by massive balls, it would be all up to him. Back to our boy Jeong, he did his best to swat away the pesky orbs. Unfortunately, despite his pimp slap being at max level, he still couldn't shake off the stubborn bastards. Slowly but surely, his stamina was draining, and it wouldn't be long until his resistance collapsed. Just as he was racking his brain for a solution, a possible Hail Mary to save his cooked ass, the room suddenly became dead silent. The orbs that were shooting toward them stopped, and all of them became stiff, not moving even an inch. Obviously, the trio were taken aback by this. Just what the hell was going on? Before they could deduce anything, the orbs started moving again, this time retreating back to Laggard. Under their confused gazes, the orbs surrounded Laggard, blocking and covering every inch of his body. Jeong watched the development and couldn't help but frown slightly. Just what was this dickless bastard plotting? But that aside, since when did the room take on this brownish hue? Moreover, when had the doors to the other rooms appeared? What the hell was going on there? Dwayne and Norman, who were beside him, also had the same doubts. They were curious to know what was going on, but one urge stood out amongst the rest. What if they used this change to escape to another room? Jeong immediately shot down that suggestion. If they couldn't even beat the weakest boss, then heading to the next room would just sign their death sentences. They had to kill this willyless bastard. Only then would they gain enough power to challenge the next door. Just as they were going over how to do it, a bizarre change occurred. One straight from a horror film. Several mouths sprouted from the orbs, all of them whispering in Laggard's voice. They grinned and laughed, occasionally mumbling troublesome over and over again, causing a chill to run down the trio's spines. As if that wasn't spooky enough, a vague outline of a face manifested amongst the mumbling mouths, further reinforcing the horrific feeling. Jeong saw the gross amalgamation of mouths and eyes and said, "Fuck that." There was no way he was letting this bastard do whatever it was he wanted to do. He would rather attack it now than live to regret it later. Besides, with how bizarrely his body was formed, it was clear it wouldn't be moving anytime soon. So what better time than now to use it as target practice? He immediately acted on this thought, activating his third door from the get-go. Beside him was Dwayne, who also unleashed his beast transformation skill. With the supreme power-ups, the duo, plus Norman, who seemed to be lacking aura in this aspect, faced off against the mutated Laggard, ready to clap some literal cheeks. Jeong was the first to act. After instructing the duo to attack simultaneously, he swiftly channeled his lightning strike, yeeting the blast towards Laggard. Next up was Dwayne, who roared at the fiend, sending a powerful shockwave toward it. Last, and definitely the least, was Norman, who chucked an underwhelming orb of poison towards L.A.G. Although his attack was pure garbage, he was luckily teamed up with Titans, so his shortcomings were mostly ignored, just like his shortcoming. As for L.A.G., he suffered the worst of it, with plenty of tongues and mouths rupturing. After the first volley, the bastard was reduced to a mangled mess, though traces of life still lingered in him. Jeong realized this and cautioned the duo against lowering their guard. He then turned to Dwayne, asking the latter to do his thing. Dwayne said, "Bet," and walked forward. When he was slightly ahead of the gang, he immediately entered a punching stance before striking the hell out of the ground. Due to his overwhelming attack, a huge boulder was yanked from the ground, which he effortlessly lifted into the air. With the DIY weapon in tow, he swiftly chucked it at L.A.G., causing a swooshing sound as it shot toward the fool. To no one's surprise, the boulder struck him like a, boulder, digging deep into his body. The force from the impact was so severe that L.A.G. was sent flying, only stopping after crashing brutally against the room wall. Beneath him was a pool of blood, which showed just how much damage he'd taken. Just as the trio were about to celebrate their victory, a low and grating voice mumbled, complaining about how troublesome it was. The gang heard this, and their expressions couldn't help but twist. How was this bastard still alive? Especially after that last attack. Before they could figure it out, L.A.G. resumed his mumbling, this time, his voice growing louder and louder. Accompanying the voice were the subtle sounds of cracking, obviously coming from the boulder. To the Chad's horror, the boulder suddenly shattered, sending shards of rock flying everywhere. Indeed, things could always get worse in L.A.G. The Chads reacted immediately to the ominous development. Norman, with his bitch ass, channeled his inner demon slayer, recreating the pimp-breathing first form, bitch slap. Dwayne, on the other hand, tanked that shit, allowing the shards to crash harmlessly against his guard. Last was the big homie Jeong, the maiden slayer Jeong, and most importantly, the chairman of the Virgin Association Jeong. His approach to dealing with the shards was the most goated. He simply erected a lightning shield, zapping all the shards to smithereens. When the barrage ended, the trio could finally see the fate of the loathsome L.A.G., and as expected, things weren't looking good. Under their tense gazes, the fool squirmed his way back to life, almost as if the past happenings were mere illusions. However, the trio knew for a fact that they weren't illusions, especially since L.A.G. was still dickless. I mean, wasn't that a big giveaway? In any case, things were looking grim, and the charging L.A.G. only made things worse. Faced with the dire development, the trio resolutely locked in, ready for whatever shit would pop off. However, after moments of quiet waiting, their faces subtly fell, puzzled by what they were witnessing. Before them was a stumbling L.A.G., harboring zero of his past aura. In fact, it almost looked like the fool had forgotten how to walk. Dwayne was the first to speak up. He asked if this was a trap. Norman seconded the idea, insisting that it was too obvious to be anything but a trap. Jeong, however, thought otherwise. He argued that this was indeed real, and L.A.G., this bastard, had somehow forgotten how to walk. Or more specifically, how to run. So although puzzling, his clumsy approach and tumble were most likely real, even though he wished the cheeks flashing weren't. Seriously though, what the hell is going on here? And why are the cheeks so glossy? Anyway, L.A.G. was really wildin', but it didn't take him long to get his shit together. After the initial failure, he realized a head was necessary to think and move, even though it was troublesome to do both. And as typical of L.A.G., even with such a realization, things couldn't be so straightforward. Instead of directly creating a head, he went the L.A.G. horror route and manifested a pair of eyes on his chest. Although this would have been horrific to the Chads on normal occasions, L.A.G. was already on the move, so they didn't have much time to think about it. Just as the fiend was about to crash Norman Sakura into meat paste, our boy Jeong joined the fray, kicking the shit out of the former. The force from the attack sent it flying, causing it to crash heavily against the room's wall. L.A.G., however, easily tanked that, walking away with only slight discomfort. He then channeled more of that L.A.G. horror effect, creating a mouth on his chest. With the ability to speak restored, he continued his usual ramblings, complaining about how troublesome it was. It was too troublesome to feel pain. Although that might sound like just his typical complaints, it was actually quite strategic, because it effectively cancelled any pain he was under. And with the pain gone, L.A.G. could resume his attack, which he promptly did. The Chads noticed the advance and locked in as well. Since the fool wanted that smoke, who were they to deny him? They swiftly charged forward, clashing headfirst against Laggard. When the commotion died down, it was the trio's second time feeling puzzled. Just what the hell was going on? After all that taunt and smoke, how could the fool be one-shotted like this? How was this even possible? And why was he so goddamn weak? Dwayne stared down at the mangled corpse before shifting his confused glance to Jeong. He didn't say much, but his question was obvious. You see this shit, right? Was he really supposed to be this weak? Norman also joined the banter, speculating that Laggard was weak because he was the first boss. He didn't know how true his conjecture was, but it at least gave an explanation for this bizarre situation. Jeong stayed silent, as always. Even though he was also confused, his regressor senses were telling him things couldn't end so simply. This was Lag, after all. True to his instincts, the mangled corpse of Laggard suddenly stirred before rising completely from the dead. Under the trio's disbelieving eyes, the corpse quickly regenerated its body, becoming whole once again. Jeong stared at the sight before sighing in acceptance. This was Lag. It really wasn't that absurd for this to happen. In fact, it would have been more suspicious if things had ended as easily as before. In any case, things were better this way, because they could at least kill this bastard again. Contrary to Jeong's acceptance, Dwayne and Norman were more concerned. Norman in particular wondered if it was even possible to kill this fool. Or was it that Laggard was immortal? Jeong told him not to overthink it. Whether he was immortal or not, they'd just have to clap them cheeks to find out. Thus, the trio lunged back into battle, clashing with Laggard soon after. After the devastating clash, Laggard was once again reduced to a meaty paste, and just like the last time, his body swiftly regenerated, bringing him back from the dead. Ignoring the bizarre scene, the trio clashed again and again, determined to see just how long the fiend could last. However, after a seemingly endless cycle of doing that shit, Norman couldn't take it anymore and said, "Fuck that." He told the Chads he was done. He couldn't keep doing that shit. In his opinion, Laggard was immortal, so continuing to fight him was pointless. Turning to Jeong, he let the latter know he was leaving. What about him? What would he do? Jeong replied that he'd stay. He still had business with the fiend. Norman said cool. It wasn't like he could force him anyway. He then turned to Dwayne. What about him? Would he stay or nah? Dwayne replied that of course he'd stay. Wherever the Poppy Jeong went, he'd follow. Norman didn't convince him either. Instead, he warned Dwayne to be careful. This Jeong bastard was clearly hiding something. Dwayne mulled over his words, but didn't say anything in the end. However, from his look, it was obvious Norman's warning had rattled him. Done with his home-breaking, discord sowing, Norman bid the duo goodbye and walked for the exit door. He lingered at the exit for a while before ultimately choosing the second room. Although he was leaving, he wasn't foolish enough to ignore Jeong's earlier warning and challenge a more dangerous room solo. Thus, he wisely chose the second door, B722, disappearing into its depths soon after. As he left, the immortal Laggard watched on passively, too lazy to give chase. If the Chad wanted to reduce his burden by leaving, then who was he to stop him? Jeong also watched him go, not interfering in the slightest. His reason, however, was different from Laggard's. He still didn't know if Norman was trustworthy or not, so having him leave the room and prevent further mishaps was great in his books. After the room settled down, Dwayne asked the question he'd been dying to know about. Was it possible to kill this fool? Jeong replied that of course it was. He just had to trust him on that. Dwayne said bet, since he'd said so, then he could only follow his lead. Jeong smiled at the trust before giving his instructions. They would kill the bastard and move to the next room, no matter what. Just as they were gassing themselves up for battle, Laggard's vibe suddenly changed, becoming more ominous. He complained about the dragged-out battle, vowing to end it as quickly as possible. Following this proclamation, his head suddenly morphed, taking on a more tentacle-like shape. As for the front, it was still as ugly as before, if not uglier, with that gigantic Rihanna-like cranium. Dwayne heard Not's diss and asked Jeong what the foolish bastard was talking about. Jeong told him to ignore the fool. Rihanna was a princess, and any man would be lucky to kiss that massive forehead. That aside, he decided to lock in on the boss and his own situation. He reflected on the number of souls he had and how he could use them effectively. Currently, he had 210 souls to burn, but he couldn't be too rash with their use. First of all, he had no idea what Laggard's weaknesses were, so he couldn't foolishly use his souls before identifying which skills would be best to counter them. Second, it was just better, and wiser, to keep an eye on the fiend for a while longer. Who knows? Maybe he'd get a pleasant surprise when it truly mattered. Done with that, the duo of Chads faced off against the cranium head Laggard, ready for battle. Just as he'd promised, Laggard made the first move, seeking to put an end to the troublesome fight. The duo noticed the movements and locked in. However, despite their caution, Laggard's move still caught them off guard, leaving them in a perilous situation. Not only was it a bizarre attack, it was also insanely fast, arriving before them in an instant. Jeong in particular cursed at the move, wondering where that speed had come from. Well, since that was the case, he might as well S&M on this cranium bastard. But first, he should probably get his tight tush out of the way. Sure, the fiend was hella fast, but it wasn't to the point where dodging was impossible. And if it was possible, why would the great him, the maiden hunter him, stay still to be yeeted? Nah, he wasn't that crazy. He easily sidestepped that shit, dodging Laggard's attack with a smug grin on his lips. Just as he was glazing himself for being goated, Laggard hit with a curveball, sending another attack at him. The attack was so unexpected that Jeong got yeeted, crashing pathetically against the room's wall. It was also during this attack that Jeong realized just how absurd Laggard's attack power was. That one strike made him feel like he'd been flogged, and he couldn't help but skid back in shock. Luckily, he was him, so he soon shrugged off the pain, even though it was a bit difficult. Locking back in, Jeong shifted his gaze to the unit Dwayne. Just like him, the unit had also been caught lacking and was now being tossed around like a rag doll. Jeong called out in worry, asking Dwayne if he was all right. Dwayne replied that of course he was. Something this trivial couldn't bring him down. Jeong immediately called cap on that. If he was really breezing through the assault, then why did he look so pathetic? Well anyway, since the unit wanted to glaze a bit, who was he to shit on his parade? And besides, he still had more important things to do. Thinking so, Jeong shifted his focus to Laggard. When he did, he discovered how the fiend had managed to hit him, even though he'd expertly dodged his main attack. Turns out Laggard could sprout tentacles not just from his arms, but also from the main tentacles themselves. Not only that, his whole body seemed to have that feature as well, since numerous tentacles continued to wiggle out of it. Soon, to Jeong's horror, the tentacles grew, becoming identical to those sussy monsters you bastards love. Jeong eyed Laggard and couldn't help but get a chilling sensation on his spine. Just like that, the stakes of the fight had tripled, and his life wasn't the only thing on the line anymore. If he couldn't prevail in this fight, then Laggard would do just that, and prevail his ass. Pause. Unfortunately, just because his tushy was on the line didn't mean Laggard would ease up on the attacks. On the contrary, it doubled down, sending a whole barrage at Jeong. Jeong saw this and locked all the fuck in. Fine, if Laggard wanted that smoke, then he'd make sure he got his high off it. Thinking so, he nimbly dodged to the side, narrowly avoiding a quick kiss with death. After the first dodge came the second, then third, and soon Jeong found himself weaving through the blows, finding zero challenge in the endeavor. On the opposite side, Dwayne was doing the same, albeit with more ease. Jeong noticed this, and he couldn't help but reflect on their situation. Sure, they were making great progress, and so far the fiend's attacks hadn't been lethal enough to make them helpless. But that in itself was the problem. They were in a deadlock, neither advancing nor retreating. If they couldn't find a way to break that circle, then they would inevitably die there, left with nothing but a corpse to curse their fates. Just as he was about to launch his Hail Mary, a booming voice thundered across the room, drawing everyone's attention. The voice was obviously from Dwayne, who somehow deemed it fit to taunt the dickless bastard. Jeong stared at the unit in shock, wondering what the hell he was up to. But that aside, was it just him, or did it seem like Laggard's attacks had become stiff for a second back there? Surely it couldn't be what he was thinking, right? With that suspicion in mind, Jeong set off to prove it. First, he continued his weaving, because without it he'd die, and in death, all his plans would be meaningless. Second, he tried to make himself as inconspicuous as possible, letting Dwayne suffer all the heat. Although that might sound like a heartless plan, the giant unit was indeed him, so keeping himself alive during that short period shouldn't be a problem. Besides, Dwayne had grown ridiculously OP during this time, and even walking on walls wasn't an issue, let alone blocking Laggard's attacks. He easily tanked that shit, weaving between the tentacles like a Greek god. Jeong felt the easing pressure and smiled at his genius. It was exactly as he'd suspected. Laggard's attacks were concentrated on Dwayne, and not him, and he already had a vague idea as to why that was the case. But first, shouldn't he take a moment to marvel at Dwayne's growth? The Chad had indeed become more OP, with his speed being just the most noticeable. In fact, Dwayne was moving so fast that his speed could be compared with Jeong's, while he had both his limitation and lightning skills activated. Without a doubt, Dwayne had clapped hella cheeks while they were separated and used all those souls to buff his skills. Locking back in, he continued his inconspicuous stalking while Dwayne drew the heat. The gentle giant had already become quite proficient in the task by now, and dealing disses wasn't that much of a stretch for him. Thanks to that and his slick tongue, Laggard had his full focus on him, and even a slight scowl could be visible on that Rihanna-like cranium. Jeong, who was watching from the sidelines, observed all this, and his conjecture was proving to be more and more solid. Just as he was about to act on it, Laggard suddenly lost his cool, lunging at Dwayne with all it had. It first sent out a single tentacle before blitzing the shit out of Dwayne, making the unit's hair stand on end. Dwayne only hesitated for a moment before unleashing his trump card. Wind-style Jutsu, second release, Beast Roar. Buffed by the maiden Tsunade, Dwayne blew those tentacles away, keeping them far from the prophesied 106, 63, and 91 measurements. If you know, you know. Jeong, on the other hand, finally rejoined the fray, satisfied with his analysis so far. He immediately taunted Laggard, eager to see if his guess had been correct all along. To his delight, Laggard took the bait, sending a whipping tentacle his way. Just as he'd thought, this was indeed Laggard's weakness. The fool couldn't take a diss. He would lose all his cool, sending a storm of attacks at whoever taunted him. However, inasmuch as he knew that, Jeong couldn't afford to lower his guard. Not only would it be stupidly unwise, but it would also be for Dwayne's sake. The poor Chad had been drawing aggro this entire time, and Jeong was certain he couldn't keep it up for long. If he didn't end this quickly, then he might as well die there. Thus, Jeong decisively drew his bone blade, morphing it into a halberd soon after. With the trusty weapon in tow, he cleaved into the ominous tentacle, slicing that bastard into two. Jeong didn't stop there. He doubled his assault, dashing forward as he sliced down the long tentacle. As he didn't forget to instruct Dwayne, telling the latter to draw Laggard's aggro. Thanks to that, Jeong managed to get close enough to deal a fatal wound, cleaving straight through Laggard's chest. He'd been aiming for his neck, but the sneaky bastard had dodged last minute, barely saving his life. Just as he was marveling at his feat, Laggard suddenly attacked, catching him completely off guard. The strike was so fast that Jeong barely had time to blink before he was yeeted square in the gut. He was thus sent flying like a kite, crashing brutally against the room's wall. Laggard, who was now beyond livid, stared at him in rage, veins bulging on his massive forehead. He vowed to end Jeong painfully. Only then would his rage be satiated. Jeong, however, ignored that shit. Why would he care about a third-rate villain's ramblings? Instead, he shifted his focus to what he'd grasped so far. Laggard's weakness was his temper. His body would become stiff, and his regeneration would slow every time he got heated. If they wanted to take him down, then this was exactly what they needed to exploit. As if he'd read Jeong's mind, Dwayne shot forward, all while howling disses at the fiend. Before Laggard could respond, he was sent flying like a kite, bashed in the back by the Chad Dwayne. Not letting go of this chance, Dwayne comboed the strike with a Superman punch, lunging in for the finishing blow. Laggard saw the hulking figure, and for the first time, genuine dread crept into his heart. Damn, this was going to hurt like a motherfucker. And of course, Dwayne made sure it did. He dug his fist into Laggard's gut, tearing the bastard apart from the inside. When the fool bounced off the floor, Dwayne was already there waiting, a thorough thrashing ready to be served. He first closed the distance before landing a vicious stomp kick on Laggard's back, forcing the fiend to arch it back like Kim K. Next, he watched on as the fiend crashed into the wall, Loki wishing for it to stay down. However, to no one's surprise, this was Lag. Like hell things would end so quickly. Laggard easily shrugged that shit off, even though his true condition looked terrible. Dwayne saw this, and couldn't help but curse. How wonderful would it have been if this tentacle bastard bit it? Well, there was no need for regrets, since at least some of the damage stuck. Speaking of damage, was it just him, or did Laggard's tentacles seem a little shorter? Flaccid, even. If so, then don't be ashamed, King. It happens to the best of us. That aside, it also meant this bastard was cooked, and his strength was definitely waning. Just as the big unit was about to capitalize on this weakness, a tentacle suddenly shot out of the ground, wrapping tightly around his leg. To Dwayne's shock, the tentacle lifted him into the air, slamming him hard against the wall. After the first devastating hit, the tentacle rose a second time, obviously going for the Loki treatment. Luckily, Dwayne wasn't alone, and Jeong quickly came to his rescue. He nimbly joined the fray, slashing Laggard's tentacle to save his boo. Done with that, he immediately pressed the attack, closing the gap between them with frightening speed. As he ran, Jeong thought of the best weapon to end this resilient fiend. Sure, the sword was great, but it wasn't enough to deal the damage he needed. If he wanted that big alpha damage, then he would need something big and possibly long. Thus, after much thought, he decided on a lance, the perfect tool to poke a fucker with. Jeong's fighting spirit instantly tripled, causing his charging speed to skyrocket. He bellowed out in rage, promising to give Laggard the worst death possible. Obviously, Laggard didn't like that, and he quickly retaliated, launching himself towards Jeong. Since the former was pushing for a frontal assault, why couldn't he do the same? Jeong noticed this, and a maniacal smile cracked on his lips. Fine. It was better this way. They might as well end it all right there. He unleashed his lightning skill, shooting forward with greater speed. Laggard also responded in kind, concentrating his attack on Jeong. The two titans went toe-to-toe with neither side relenting, and after much struggle, they finally reached the climax with both parties going all in. Blood sputtered in the wake of the attack, and all that was left was a silhouette of carnage. And within that carnage, Dwayne's voice rang, clearly worried about Jeong. Just as it seemed over for our boy, the camera suddenly panned, showing the scene behind him. In that scene, Laggard's body appeared, cleanly severed in two. His left arm was gone, and even his torso and leg weren't spared either. Without a doubt, the resilient fool had clearly lost that fight. Laggard dropped to the ground, unable to bear his own weight. However, even with all that damage, he still refused to give up. He struggled with all he had, desperately trying to heal himself. Jeong saw this and chuckled at his tenacity. Did he really think he'd stay still and let him heal? What kind of kush was it smoking? Nah, he should forget that. He would definitely end him right then and there. Thinking so, Jeong lifted his great axe, cleaving Laggard straight in two. But he didn't stop there. He continued his savage attack, dicing Laggard's body into literal meat chunks. After a gruesome and oddly satisfying vent, he finally stopped. He then turned his gaze to the mangled Laggard, waiting to see if he could recover from that. Dwayne also joined in on the task, his face clearly tense. Surely the fool couldn't recover from that, right? Jeong replied that he wasn't sure, but to be safe, it was better if they kept their guards up. Just as he said that, a soul floated from Laggard's body, signifying that he was truly dead. Only after seeing that soul did the duo finally relax, plopping on the ground with a tired sigh. They decided to rest a bit, because who knew what shit show would be waiting for them next. Not only that, but Laggard was just the weakest of the 7 bosses, so shit was definitely going to get cooked soon enough. After resting for a while, the duo finally got back to work, with Laggard's soul being the first on the list. The stubborn freak had dropped 50 souls, so the two ended up sharing it in half. With that done, they turned to face the next door, B712. Dwayne immediately tensed up, dreading what they'd find inside. He asked Jeong if there would be bosses similar to Laggard on the other side. Jeong replied that they'd definitely be stronger than Laggard. He was just the weakest after all. This was Lag. Running into terrible monsters was inevitable. The only way to cope was to face them head-on. Dwayne chuckled at their predicament before sighing softly. Inasmuch as he hated this place, he still couldn't stop himself from getting used to it. Just how messed up was that? Jeong replied that he wasn't the only one. On the contrary, he'd adapted to the Hellway earlier than him. However, if there was something to note, it would be that he cherished meeting Dwayne and Kara. Being stuck in the game had eroded his emotions, and it was only due to the two that he'd somewhat recovered his feelings. Because of them, he could finally feel like a proper human again. Jeong cast the simpy thoughts aside and headed for the next room. Now wasn't the time to get lost in his feels. He resolutely pushed open the door, letting it slam shut soon after. On the other side was a bizarre scene, one the duo hadn't expected to run into. The room was packed to the brim with tons of baddies to choose from. Oh, and there were a bunch of chads there. But who cares about them? When they entered, a few groups turned to face them, but Jeong instantly ignored them. Instead, he had his sights set on the soul in the middle. Just what the hell was that? And why wasn't anyone going after it? Without a doubt, things were getting fishy, and he had a feeling he'd be clapping a hell lot of cheeks in this room. No homo, of course. Jeong thought about it for a second, but ultimately didn't make a move. Without adequate information, it would be foolish to wantonly cause chaos. However, that was just his opinion. What about Dwayne? What did he think? Dwayne replied that he was down for whatever. Whether they were clapping mega cheeks or stealthily leaving the room, he could do either. And besides, the room's mission hadn't updated, which meant they were free to act. Whatever they decided to do, at the very least, they had the option to safely retreat in case shit hit the fan. Jeong replied that he was right. Without the room's mission restricting them, they indeed had more freedom to act. But before any of that, they should at least figure out what was going on in the room. Inwardly, he marveled at how bizarre it was. The room was packed with 30 people, and there was a giant soul in the middle, yet no one made any moves to get it. Just what the hell was going on? Had L.A.G suddenly changed and everyone become benevolent all of a sudden? Nah, fuck that. There had to be something else going on. Anyway, there was only one way to find out. He turned to Dwayne, instructing the big unit to roll with him. Dwayne silently nodded before following suit. If there was indeed a mystery in this room, then the homie Jeong would definitely figure it out. So he might as well follow his lead. The two chads walked confidently towards the soul, and for some reason, the others didn't try to stop them. This strange sight caught Dwayne's attention, and he couldn't help but ask Jeong what was going on. Was this a trap, or were these fools high on that Escobar sauce, that Colombian good? Jeong replied that he didn't know. However, what he did know was that the bastards didn't see the need to stop them, almost as if their failure was inevitable. Dwayne's brow knit at the reply, but ultimately decided against commenting. They would soon figure out the truth anyway. As he thought this, the duo finally arrived at the soul pedestal. Jeong didn't waste any time and immediately acted to retrieve it. However, to his surprise, the soul refused to be claimed, almost as if it had a will of its own. Just when Jeong was wondering what was happening, the system provided an answer explaining that the soul had conditions to its claim. Only when the number of participants in the room dropped to below 3 would the soul be successfully released. Jeong sucked in a deep breath at this reply. He'd expected there was a condition to it, but he'd never thought it would be this harsh. With the many people in the room, wasn't this the same as asking for a massacre? Indeed, there was never a free lunch in L.A.G. But even so, wasn't this a bit too much? Did the game really expect them to kill each other without even knowing how many souls there were in the lump? What if they went through the trouble and still got one soul in the end? Wouldn't that be a bitch? Dwayne sighed at the absurdity of it all before flicking his gaze across the room. So that's why everyone was hesitating. They wanted the soul, but were debating whether the trouble was worth it or not. On one hand, there was a chance the soul count was booty, so fighting to the death for it would be pure lunacy. On the other hand, there was a possibility that the soul count was astronomical, so fighting for it was indeed worth it. They had no idea which was the case, but human greed and instinct compelled them to stick around and find out. Dwayne sighed again before turning to Jeong this time. The conditions were too bizarre. So what would they do? Would they leave or nah? Jeong replied that they should leave. Since the main mission stayed the same, they might as well get the hell out of there. There was no need to get involved in all that smoke. Dwayne was taken aback by that reply. With the mysterious soul and the several cheeks waiting to be clapped, Jeong wanted to leave? Just like that? That was definitely unexpected from him. Jeong replied that the risk was not worth it. Inasmuch as he would love to tenderize all those cheeks. Pause. Wait. Maybe unpause because he does want to tenderize them. Anyway, the risks of the fight weren't worth the potential rewards. 2 against 30 wasn't an ideal fight, and the worst part was they couldn't stop until the end. Otherwise, it would all be pointless. If they embarked on that endeavor, then they could only kill everyone or die. There was no third solution. But all that aside, even if they could kill everyone there, was it really worth it to do so? That was 30 lives they were talking about. He didn't want to kill so many people without reason. Dwayne smirked at the answer. Was this the so-called character development? The rogue Jeong had really done a ton of growing in this time. It was almost beautiful to watch. Jeong caught the slight smug expression on Dwayne's face before switching the topic. He let the Chad know there was another reason why they should leave that place as soon as possible. And that reason was Kara. They had to find her immediately. Dwayne visibly perked up at the reminder. He asked Jeong if Kara could be ahead of them. Jeong replied that there was indeed a chance of that being the case. The gothic baddie was way stronger than they thought she was. He was positive she was still alive somewhere. However, that was precisely the problem. If Kara was still alive, just like he thought she was, then the baddie was probably doing her best to find them as well. And that meant she was rashing. In any other situation, that would have been great. But this was L.A.G. Rashing and L.A.G meant mistakes, and mistakes meant death. If they didn't find her soon, then there was a chance they'd lose her forever. Dwayne frowned for a second before his face turned somber. If that was the case, then they might as well book it. Who cares about souls when their only maiden might be in trouble? And besides, without Kara, the homie Jeong would go back to being maidenless, and no one wants to see that shit. The dude has already suffered for way too long. The duo resolutely turned their backs to the soul, walking slowly towards the door. Just as Jeong was about to open it, a loud boom came from behind them, scaring the shit out of them. The Chads immediately turned to check, and what they saw amazed them. The room had descended into madness, and 2 players were already dead. Jeong eyed the murderous freaks incredulously. Couldn't they wait until they left the room to do this shit? Why were they so hell-bent on dragging them into this? Obviously, the murderous freaks didn't reply because they were, murdering. But that aside, did Jeong really think he could escape this smoke so easily? This was L.A.G after all. Seemingly getting the gist, Dwayne cursed at the horrible timing. Couldn't they wait a little bit longer? What was up with the chaos all of a sudden? Jeong replied that it was too late for regrets, and besides, the timing didn't matter at all. One way or another, the bastards would have fought, and knowing L.A.G, they would have still gotten roped into it no matter what they did. As he saw it, the timing and reasons were negligible. What truly mattered was that they were cooked from the second they entered this room. Taking a step back, he watched as the people butchered each other. The balance that had been keeping them at bay was finally broken, and the greed and desperation burst out, causing them to fall into the abyss. Jeong watched the wanton slaughter passively, a neutral expression on his face. Even though the room had descended into madness, it still had nothing to do with him. Since he'd decided to leave, he'd do just that, regardless of whatever was happening around him. Unfortunately, just because he didn't want smoke didn't mean others wouldn't bring that smoke to him. On the wall to their left, a stealthy bastard was creeping forward, obviously attempting to flank our boys. Dwayne noticed the lunging fool and scoffed mockingly. Did he really think he could take them on by himself? Talk about being blinded by greed. Or maybe he had eyes but couldn't see Mount Tai? In any case, he would be like those generic cultivation MCs and bitch-slap this fool. He immediately teamed up with Jeong, zapping and blowing the hell out of the bastard. Wait. Pause. That doesn't sound right. Something about that sentence is mad sus. Actually, on second thought, fuck it. Go ahead and blow that fool. Since I've committed to the sus, I might as well go all in. They both let him have it, making sure to blow him until his legs hit the air. Unfortunately, this wasn't enough, as the sturdy bastard easily tanked that shit. Dwayne eyed the freak and couldn't help but whistle in amusement. To think he'd survive all that. Seems like he didn't make it all the way there, with luck alone. The stealthy fool grew enraged by the taunt. How dare he mock him after blowing him so hard? Pause. He vowed to teach him a lesson. Only then would that smoldering vengeance be cooled. But before that, where did the other bastard go? He could have sworn there were 2 of them just now. Just as the fool was freaking out, Jeong suddenly spawned above him, lunging in for a deadly strike. The player acted immediately, switching his stance and countering with a powerful slash. As the player braced for impact, Jeong suddenly pulled a fast one, doing a double jump and going in for a spinning axe kick. The player was momentarily dazed, causing his reaction to slow by a second. Obviously, Jeong took advantage of this, spinning even faster and landing a vicious kick on the fool's head. The impact made the player's skull burst open, brain matter and eyes popping out of their sockets. But Jeong didn't relent. He doubled his assault, burying the poor fool into the concrete floor. With the player's death, Jeong calmly collected his soul, finding zero challenge in the endeavor. Done with that, the duo collectively turned their attention to the rest of the players, and what they saw was pure mayhem. Everywhere they turned their gazes, blood was flowing like a river, and it wouldn't be long until the whole group fell. However, before that, would they possibly be lucky this time and avoid that shit show of a mess? Surely their luck had to be good sometimes, right? Dwayne eyed Jeong, almost as if he'd sensed his naive words. He then cast his gaze back to the players, an incredulous glint in his eyes. Were these guys for real? How could they fight so desperately for a reward they knew nothing about? What if the soul count ended up being mediocre? Jeong replied that it was expected. In that hell, souls were akin to their lives, so of course they'd fight for them with all they had. And besides, he seemed to be forgetting something. Fighting to the death wouldn't just give them the prize reward, but also the souls dropped by the other players. If he thought about it that way, then it was indeed worth it. Dwayne agreed before shifting his gaze backward. It seemed some ignorant fools had come courting death once again. He smirked at Jeong, pointing at the bastards who thought they were easy prey to vanquish. Jeong cast his gaze over but didn't comment on it. If the fools wanted death, who was he to deny them? Speaking of the fools, they ignorantly ignored the warning signs, opting to proceed with their attack. They then devised a plan, choosing to split the duo amongst themselves. Just as the barbarian motherfucker was about to act, a dull, piercing sound rang, followed by an intense pain that made him freeze. When he shifted his gaze downward, he was shocked to find a sword impaled through his gut. Turns out the poor fellow had been literally backstabbed, and the culprit was none other than his partner. With his dying breath, he shouted at the latter, asking why he'd done that. The partner replied that he was doing the necessary. He shouldn't act innocent or surprised, because he was sure he'd planned to do the same to him anyway. The only difference was that he'd acted faster. This was L.A.G. He shouldn't blame him, because it was all for survival. Before the treacherous bastard could enjoy his spoils, a deep voice whispered from behind, telling him he was goddamn right. This was L.A.G, and it was indeed all for survival. Since that was the case, he shouldn't blame him either, because he too wanted to survive. Saying so, a blade cut through the betrayer's head, splitting it in half. When the corpse collapsed to the ground, a third party was revealed, who'd been apparently stalking the stalker all along. It's true what they say. When the mantis stalks the cicada, the oriole waits behind. Done with that, the new betrayer cast his gaze on the Chads, clearly eager to die. Dwayne saw this and couldn't help but smirk. Were the players in this room high for real? Because how else could you explain their tendency to crave death? Only that Venezuelan powder could get them tripping like this. Well anyway, it made no difference to him. He might as well get this over with. He turned to Jeong, telling the latter he was ready for whatever. Jeong said bet. Since it had come to this, they might as well wild out. Coincidentally, even though they'd been roped into this fight, they stood the best chance at coming out on top. All the other fighters were weary of each other and were constantly on guard against being backstabbed. However, the same couldn't be said about them. They were the only team that could truly watch each other's back. That being said, whether they clapped cheeks or not would be up to Dwayne. This fight involved humans, and he knew how Dwayne felt about that. He didn't want to force him to do anything, so he was leaving the choice in his hands. And besides, forcing him would only backfire, because fighting half-heartedly would definitely get them killed. He wasn't that foolish, so he was leaving it in the unit's hands this time. Dwayne thought about it for a moment. To clap or not to clap? That was the age-old question. Which one should he choose? After much thought, the door to B713 closed with a bang. It seemed Dwayne had made his choice. Contrary to what you might have thought, the two Chads were still in the room, meaning Dwayne literally opened the door, then shut it again just to emphasize that he was staying. It's a bit dramatic, but hey, do your thing, King. Noticing Jeong's odd gaze, Dwayne explained his reasoning. Sure, he hated human conflicts and needless killing, but this was L.A.G. Just because he didn't like it didn't mean it wouldn't find its way to him. Their current situation was a clear example of this. They'd tried to escape the smoke but still ended up being roped into this shit, and if it could happen once, then it could definitely happen again. Since that was the case, he might as well grab it by the poo, sorry, I meant horns, and do what needs to be done. It was the only way to survive in L.A.G after all. Jeong said bet. Since he'd come to that conclusion, then he'd do his best to have his back, starting with clapping those trio's cheeks over there. Dwayne said cool. If they were going to do it, then they might as well be thorough about it, meaning they should definitely clap that treacherous bastard first. Such taming bastards should always be taken out first, because who knows what shit they might do. Jeong agreed with this. One encounter with Tae-ming was more than enough for him. Thus, the two promptly powered up, jumping into the fray soon after. On the opposite side, the trio of bastards also geared up, swiftly joining them in their tango. Unfortunately for us, the author decided to be lazy this time and off-screened the fight. Or maybe the Chads clapped so much cheeks that the author couldn't possibly illustrate it all. In any case, the trio of bastards was off-screened, and the only visuals we got were of the other mangled corpses and, of course, our CHADY duo wrapping things up. After the assumed intense fight, Jeong heaved a sigh of relief as he caught his breath. By his side, Dwayne did the same, although his condition seemed way worse than Jeong's. Jeong noticed this and immediately asked the unit if he was all right. Dwayne replied that he was fine. He just needed a minute to catch his breath. He then added that the reason he looked like shit was because of his private attribute. In his case, the attribute was negative because it imposed a 5% extra consumption on his stamina whenever he used an active skill. In normal fights it wouldn't be an issue, but for long battles like the one they had just been through, things became a little more hectic. However, Jeong shouldn't worry because he'd be as good as new in no time. He just needed a little bit of rest. Jeong said okay, but deep down he was hella worried. He knew Dwayne was acting tough because his true condition couldn't be hidden from him. However, since the unit had said he was fine, he couldn't do anything but accept it. There was no need to trample on the Chad's pride, after all. That being said, he really hoped they could be more honest with each other. On his end, for example, he hoped he could tell Dwayne he was a regressor. But unfortunately now wasn't the time or place to do that. Maybe in the future he'd get a chance to do so, but for now, he should focus more on their survival. Speaking of survival, didn't they do all this for more souls? They should probably check out their loot then. Hopefully it would make all the effort worth it. The two decisively walked to the pedestal, a hint of anticipation gleaming in their eyes. Dwayne in particular couldn't keep his curiosity at bay and openly asked Jeong how many souls he thought were in there. Jeong didn't reply. He simply reached out to the orb. What was the point of speculating? They might as well crack it open to find out. Just as he was about to collect the soul, the ground suddenly shook, scaring the shit out of them. The duo immediately sensed danger and wisely backpedaled, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and the pedestal. After the trembling had passed, they turned towards the orb, and what they saw, low-key, surprised them. Beside the pedestal was another player, a likely survivor from the earlier massacre, and although this would not be a big deal on normal occasions, they were currently exhausted, so the timing couldn't be anything but tragic. Jeong cursed the fiend, mocking him for hiding in the ground like a common pest. He aimed to enrage the bastard, hopefully distracting him from collecting the soul. Unfortunately, that didn't work, and the bastard collected the soul almost immediately. He even smirked at them, maintaining eye contact as he stole what was rightfully theirs. If you're hating on this asshole already, then you'd be glad to know that the system hates him as well. For instance, his name is Jake Bug, which is quite fitting considering he hides in the ground like a bitch-ass bug. That aside, his public attribute is tough skin, which I shit you not, the system compares to literal cowhide. Not steel, not bronze, heck not even leather, but plainly cowhide. Damn, the system really did him dirty with that one. Anyway, the thieving bastard successfully stole the souls, much to the duo's dissatisfaction. However, before he could relish in his theft, his face suddenly changed, almost as if he'd seen something unsightly. He then proceeded to curse out loud, hurling insults at whoever was unfortunate enough to catch the strays. At first, the duo was confused, even believing the bastard was putting on an act. However, as the intensity of his reaction grew, they finally realized this was the real deal, and something had gone horribly wrong. Jeong contemplated asking what was up, but that became unnecessary since the bastard volunteered the info for free. Turns out L.A.G had pulled a fast one, and the lump indeed had just one soul, kinda like he'd speculated earlier. Dwayne was shocked by this, but Jeong stayed passive, almost like he'd expected such fuckery from L.A.G. As a regressor, he'd experienced way worse from the game, so this much was nothing to him. However, if there was one thing that did draw his attention, it would be that they were insanely lucky. If the lump had an absurd amount of souls, just like they'd hoped, then they would have been cooked, since this bug bastard would have used that power against them. But since it was only one, then they could be considered lucky and should thank the treacherous game instead. Bug also realized this, and his face instantly turned demonic. Since he couldn't get his hands on the souls he wanted, he opted to attack them instead, because there was no way he was leaving there with nothing. Dwayne told him bet. If he was that eager to get clapped, then he should fuck around and find out. Jeong also joined the fray, welcoming Bug to the smoke. Since the fucker was delivering himself for a cheek polishing, who was he to say no? He'd make sure to wax that ass, keeping it clean and crispy for the clapping. Pause. Bug said try me and disappeared into the ground. Thanks to a mysterious skill, he lived up to his name, fully embodying a common pest. Dwayne and Jeong, on the other hand, felt a headache creeping in because these stealthy types were always the worst to deal with. If they couldn't figure out his skill and its limitations, then they'd quickly find themselves in a perilous situation. True to their speculations, Bug suddenly spawned behind them, catching both of them off guard. He swiftly lunged at Dwayne, clocking the unit in the back. Jeong saw this and immediately closed in to counterattack. He moved so fast that Bug barely had time to react. However, the key term was barely, because the fool still had enough time to launch a sneak attack on our boy. He deployed his heat vision eyes, a move that made Jeong's scalp tingle. For whatever reason, he was feeling an intense sense of danger from those eyes, so he didn't dare face them head-on. Deciding to trust in his instincts, Jeong ducked below the beam, narrowly escaping the ladder by an inch. Done with that, he closed in to counterattack, but by then it was already too late, and the sly Bug had already escaped. The duo cursed, but there was nothing they could do. Just as they'd expected, the stealthy fucker was going to use the terrain advantage, and the only way to stop him was to crack his skill. However, that was easier said than done. Jeong thought about it before deciding to do what he could for now. First, he warned Dwayne about the laser eyes, because those weren't things they could face off against. Next, he calmed his chaotic mind and used the piece to figure out their situation. Why did Bug attack Dwayne and not him? The answer to that question was obvious, and the implications made Jeong's frown deepen. Dwayne was tired, and it seemed his condition was worse than Jeong had expected. Worse still, Bug seemed to know about it. That's why he attacked Dwayne first. Jeong realized this, and his mood instantly worsened. If they didn't end this fight quickly, then things would really get out of hand. Thinking to this point, he shouted at Dwayne to be careful, warning him of the impending attack. Dwayne said okay, but it was obvious Bug's sneak attacks were more than troublesome to deal with. Just as he was contemplating how best to protect himself, Bug suddenly spawned behind him, catching him lacking once again. He landed a vicious kick on Dwayne's flank, causing the latter to reel in pain. Dwayne endured the blow and grabbed Bug by the leg. Since the fucker wanted to play cat and mouse, he might as well OG Tom and Jerry on his ass. He yeeted the fool to the ground, recreating the iconic Tom vs. Jerry fights. And yes, I said Tom and Jerry instead of Loki, because the two Chads did it first, way before the Prince of Asgard did. Bug suffered the brunt of the blow, causing him to cough up a shit ton of blood. However, halfway through his bitchy whining, he suddenly locked in, deciding to use his laser beam at maximum intensity. Jeong peeped the glowing eyes and he couldn't help but curse. Damn, what the hell was this Homelander wannabe doing in L.A.G? He swiftly called out to Dwayne, warning him to be careful. Dwayne heard the warning and immediately shifted his gaze to Bug. Upon doing so, he realized the stealthy motherfucker was locked and loaded, ready to zap him to kingdom come. Dwayne said fuck that and instantly backpedaled, narrowly avoiding a laser attack to the balls. Yes, I said balls. For whatever reason, Bug chose to target the balls even though there were plenty of better options to choose from. Anyway, luckily the sadistic freak missed, and Dwayne survived another day with his crown jewels. As for Bug, he crashed heavily to the ground, clearly still reeling from the Loki treatment. Just as he was about to recover for a devastating counter, a swift knee clocked his face, making a complete mess of his already ugly mug. The impact was so severe that Bug's head got pinned to the ground, a sickening crack echoing about. When Jeong's knee left his face, the formerly ugly Bug became unrecognizable, a mere shadow of his pathetic self. However, even with all that damage, Jeong wasn't done and quickly lunged in for a finisher attack. Sure, some might think it was excessive, but in a hell like L.A.G, leaving loose ends is the quickest way to die. Just look at Liam and his bitch ass. Thus, Jeong came in fists swinging, ready to put an end to this fool. However, as typical of L.A.G, things wouldn't go as smoothly as you'd want them to. In that brief interlude to death, Bug suddenly got an epiphany, gaining enlightenment like he was an MC or some shit. He suddenly learned a new skill, allowing him to narrowly escape Jeong's monstrous finisher attack. When Dwayne saw this, his gaze froze and he immediately asked Jeong what was going on. Jeong replied that he didn't know, but he suspected L.A.G was back to its bullshit again. For whatever reason, an extra-like Bug was granted a power-up, so he believed things were about to get complicated. Dwayne frowned at the reply before asking Jeong what they should do next. Jeong replied that he wasn't certain, but their best bet was to watch each other's backs and remain vigilant. Whatever the game wanted to show them would be popping up soon, so they'd wait until then to react. As soon as he said that, a corpse was pulled into the ground, marking the official start of their horror. Soon, other corpses were pulled into the ground, disappearing in quick succession just like the first one. Before they could react, the whole room was wiped clean, robbed of the numerous corpses that littered its floor. However, that was just the beginning, as the very ground before them started quaking and shaking. To the duo's horror, the ground suddenly burst open, revealing a silhouette straight out of a horror film. The previously ugly Bug now stood before them, his visage so terrifying even his mama wouldn't love it. He had faces morphed into his body, all of them screaming and crying in pain. Bug looked at the terrified duo and proudly introduced himself. He was now Glutton, a special mutated being thanks to the Corpse Devourer skill. He had received new characteristics as well, with the most significant one being that he had many lives. As for how harrowing he looked on the outside, he didn't mind that at all, since he was a firm believer that beauty lies on the inside and not the outside. Jeong looked at the ugly abomination and told him to stop kidding himself. What beauty lies on the inside? As far as he was concerned, Bug was so ugly even his inner beauty didn't matter at all. Besides, how could he talk about beauty when he had literal corpses sticking to his flesh? He better cut that bullshit out. Bug replied that he was low-key right. But so what? With the flood of power coursing through his veins, did it truly matter how he looked? In fact, with the strength he had, clapping both Dwayne and Jeong wouldn't be much of an issue to him. On top of that, he was a very vindictive person, so he'd make sure to get his just revenge. He'd polish, clap, and tear their asses up, making sure to do so in the no homo, of course. Jeong's scalp tingled at the threat, an overwhelming feeling of unease assaulting his ass, literally. He immediately identified Bug as a formidable threat, one they couldn't afford to take their eyes off of. However, just because he wanted to didn't mean he could. Bug moved with so much speed that he completely disappeared from their senses. When he appeared next, he'd already closed the distance, landing a nasty punch on Dwayne. The giant unit reeled from the attack, forced to take several steps back to barely recover. Luckily, he'd blocked. Otherwise, he would have been a goner with just that one blow. Bug picked up on this weakness and immediately pressed the attack, hoping to finish off Dwayne with the next blow. However, our boy was still him, so he managed to dodge that attack as well. Unfortunately, that's where his luck ran out, as the next punch caught him straight in the gut. Dwayne coughed up a mouthful of blood as he secretly cursed his shitty stamina. It was because of this drain that he'd failed to react, leading him to this unfavorable situation. But even if he cursed, would it change his situation? Nah, especially since Bug was already on the move. The creepy fucker was going in for a finisher, determined to give Dwayne that patented Hulk smash special. Luckily, the unit wasn't alone, and Jeong quickly intervened to rescue him. He came in with a stab attack, driving the blade into Bug's brain. When that wasn't enough, Jeong channeled his lightning skill, doing his best to melt Bug's brain into goo. The attack worked for a while, until it suddenly didn't, evident by the wicked smirk on Bug's lips. Jeong, who was still oblivious to this, continued his assault, unaware his body was open for a counterattack. Obviously, Bug didn't waste this chance and immediately retaliated, landing a vicious punch on Jeong's flank. The blow sent our boy flying, causing him to crash pathetically against the wall. Bug, the culprit for this attack, taunted smugly, telling Jeong to wait his turn. As soon as he was done with Dwayne, he'd pull up on him, so he shouldn't be too impatient for his loving. As for Dwayne, he offered him a slight smile, because it was only due to him that he confirmed his many lives. Sure, he'd received a hint from the system, but this was L.A.G we were talking about. Like hell he'd trust in this scamming game. That aside, he marveled at the many lives he apparently had. Oh, how magical it was when the game was on your side. Jeong also noticed this, and his face darkened. Just whose idea was it to give this bastard plot armor? If he found the person responsible, he'd make sure to feed him a two-piece combo. Settling his emotions, he went about figuring out a strategy for the inevitable clash. Since Bug had swallowed 30 corpses, it was probable that the fiend now had 30 lives, so he needed a plan to kill him 30 times, at the very least. However, was that even possible? Especially with the horrible condition Dwayne was in? Well, there was only one way to find out. He resolutely locked in, shooting Bug a menacing glare. Bug picked up on the glare and chuckled softly. What? Did he think looks could kill or something? If he wanted that smoke, he should go ahead and try him. His hands were already rated E for everyone. That aside, he was genuinely curious who would come out on top. He who had multiple lives and only needed to kill them once, or they who had one life but still needed to kill him several times. It was sure to be a spectacle. Jeong told him to shut his mouth and come at them. It wasn't like they had all day. Bug said cool and lunged forward, his first target the spent Dwayne. Unfortunately, just like the last time, the author became lazy again, and most of the fight was off-screened. When the panel finally zoomed in on our boys, they were already spent, with Dwayne looking like he could collapse at any time. Through his inner monologue, we learned that the duo had really given it their all, having managed to kill Bug a total of 11 times. However, when compared to his 30 lives, they were still a lot off. Bug, who was also aware of this, chuckled at their plight, a sadistic smug hanging on his lips. He told the Chads to give up, because nothing they did would work on him. Dwayne was compelled to believe the same and quickly urged Jeong to leave him behind. If it was him, then he was sure the CHADY unit would make it out somehow. Jeong told him to shut up. There was no way he'd leave him behind. And since things had gotten to this point, he might as well say fuck it and go all out. Dwayne looked at Jeong incredulously. Did he still have an ace up his sleeve? Jeong replied that of course he did. Who did he think he was? He was him, thou, thee, and on some special occasions, himeth. If he didn't have an ace up his sleeve, then who else could? Dwayne should step back because he was about to cook in this bitch. If they were lucky, then he'd definitely kill this fool. If not, well, he could only say deuces to their cheeks, because they were about to get clapped. Pause. Jeong made his bold declaration as he started his intense stare-down with Bug. However, after seconds of quiet inaction, Dwayne finally had enough and asked what was wrong. Didn't he say he was him? Then why was he just standing there? Jeong replied that everything was good. It might not look like it, but his mind was currently big-braining this shit, so Dwayne shouldn't worry. But that aside, why was he so focused on his business? Shouldn't he be using this chance to recover instead? If he had the energy to cling so far up his ass, then surely he could spare some to recover, right? Choosing to ignore the meddling Dwayne, Jeong turned his focus back to Bug and himself. He might have sounded mad cocky, but in truth, he was also at his limit. After the severe thrashing Bug had blessed them with, his body was already on the brink of collapse, and any mishaps could spell their doom. If his final gamble didn't work out, then he might as well redeem that cheek-clapping coupon because they would be cooked. Luckily, things hadn't deteriorated to that point, so he still had some hope, although barely. Bug might have not realized this, but there were subtle differences in his bodily reactions when he attacked, and it was precisely these differences that he planned to exploit. Sure, it was a far-fetched plan, one more desperate than logical, but what else could he do? When facing off against a superior foe, even desperate gambles become valid tactics, provided you don't back down and give it your all. As for how things would turn out, why would he care about that when his only outcomes would be victory or death? In both cases, the crisis would be resolved, so why should he care? Bug noticed the slowly advancing Jeong and chuckled softly. Did the Chad really plan to face him on his own even after he'd proved he could clap them both as a tag team? Surely he couldn't be that crazy, right? Or maybe he'd discovered some sort of method to better level the playing field. In any case, it didn't matter to him because the duo would still be cooked. In fact, he preferred if they struggled like that, because it would make vanquishing them all the more enjoyable. Jeong guessed Bug's thoughts and clapped back immediately. He told the bastard to not get so cocky. As far as he was concerned, the so-called overwhelming power he now possessed was just a product of luck and plot armor. Without it, he would have been clapped ages ago. Bug smirked at Jeong's pitiful attempt at provocation. He told the Chad to stop spewing bullshit. If he could really defeat him as he'd claimed, then he should go ahead and do it, instead of bullshitting all the way over there. Oh, and just so he knew, his taunt had indeed worked because his desire to kill him had definitely skyrocketed. He very much wanted to hear the squeal he'd produce after getting his hand yanked off. Jeong told him bet. If he thought he had the ability to get him to squeal like a bitch, then he should go ahead and try it. Bug immediately accepted the challenge. He resolutely stepped forward. He couldn't keep Jeong waiting, after all. Jeong also stepped forward, but he didn't immediately act. Instead, he cast his gaze to the squirming faces on Bug's body. After careful observation, he'd realized that those parts were the most chaotic on Bug's body. His guess was that the lingering spirits in those faces still held an intense greed for souls, making the body's control and reactions sloppy. If he could exploit that weakness, then he might have a chance of bringing this bastard down. If he couldn't, well, there was no point thinking about that, because he still had to try anyway. Bug didn't hesitate any longer and immediately lunged at Jeong. He moved with so much speed that he'd basically spawned before the latter. Jeong acted quickly and instantly erected his electric shield. Thanks to his action, he'd barely managed to block the sneak attack, although that was definitely too close for his comfort. Locking back in, Jeong noticed that Bug's speed had increased once again. He didn't know if it was a result of the fool being enraged, but that level of intensity was definitely not something he could handle right now. If he wanted to buy as much time as he could to enact his plan, then he had to switch tactics. Just as he was about to act, Bug suddenly doubled his assault, pinning him down once again. He taunted Jeong, asking the Chad where his past bravado was. Didn't he say he would clap him? Then where was that smoke? Or was he planning to hide behind his shield forever? Well, if that was the case, he might as well help him out. There was nothing like a little beating to stimulate that inner fire after all. Saying so, he easily tore through Jeong's shield, landing a nasty punch on his face. The blow sent Jeong flying, causing him to crash pathetically against the wall. When Jeong finally collected himself, he couldn't help but curse his shitty luck. Not only was the bastard leagues above him in terms of speed and strength, but his electric shield was also useless against him, meaning he couldn't even block his attacks. If he added all those points together, then it was clear this was a fight he had no business winning. However, was he to give up just because of that? Hell nah. He was Jeong motherfucking Hyeok. Like hell he'd give up that easily. He'd rather die than let this many-faced bastard stomp on him. Bug noticed the determined gleam in his eyes and shot him a confused glance. Didn't he have a big-brained plan he wanted to execute? Then what was he waiting for? If he didn't hurry up and use all his trump cards, then he'd miss the opportunity to do so, because he was done playing around. Jeong registered the threat but didn't react. He continued to mad dog Bug, showing no signs of action. Bug clicked in annoyance before lunging at Jeong. Fine. If the fool didn't want to show his hand, then he'd force him to. He refused to believe Jeong would still hold back when his very life was in danger. He rushed at him, his claws poised to stab Jeong through. Just as his attack was about to land, Bug's body suddenly stiffened, causing him to stop immediately. He puzzlingly shot his gaze to the left, wondering what the hell was going on. To his shock, he found that the face on his arm was attempting to break free, resulting in his body stiffening. Not only that, the creepy fucker had its tongue out, almost as if it was hungry for something. Bug stared in horror at the sight, puzzled by what was going on. When he looked in the direction the face was pulling him toward, everything suddenly made sense. Turns out the lingering spirit in the face was greedy for some souls, so it revolted and attempted to seize control of the body to go after it. Not only that, there were other souls scattered around the body, meaning Bug's horror was just beginning. Predictably, the various faces on his body collectively revolted, each going after a lump of souls. Not to mention, the souls were perfectly spaced out, making movement impossible under their collective pull. Bug realized his dire predicament and cursed furiously. Was this the so-called divine punishment for excessive greed? If he'd known things would turn out like this, he wouldn't have consumed so many corpses. Jeong smirked at the trapped bug as he slowly rose from the ground. He then burst out laughing, taunting that it wasn't his time to die just yet. However, since one of them definitely has to die, why don't Bug be a darling and do just that? Bug shouted in rage, asking Jeong what he'd done. He might not be the smartest, but he was damn sure none of this was a coincidence. Jeong replied that of course it wasn't. How foolish was he to even think it was? There was no way the mighty him would rely on such things to survive. As for how he did it? Well, he can only be a Chad and explain to his small brain how the big boys plan shit out. It wasn't that complicated, really. He simply gave him and his body what they wanted. Souls. Of course, his body is a mess of faces, spirits, and greed, so the likelihood of the current situation happening was rather high. He'd suspected the spirits in the faces wouldn't be able to resist the temptation of souls, so he'd gambled on this plan. Luckily, things had turned out great, and he could fully enjoy him standing there, looking stupid. Bug's face instantly fell. He realized he'd been playing on Jeong's palm the entire time. During their fight, when he'd thought he was giving Jeong a thorough cheek polishing, it turned out the Chad was using those attacks to stealthily spread souls around him. Not only that, the cunning bastard had done so in a way that the souls would be out of reach, preventing him from absorbing any of them. And since he couldn't absorb them, he would continue to be trapped by the pulling faces, rendering any resistance futile. Speaking of faces, their greed for souls suddenly intensified, causing them to pull even harder. They relentlessly tugged at Bug's body, causing the already frail balance to collapse. Little by little, the various faces tore free from the body, pulling Bug's limbs with them. Bug screamed in agony, but by then it was already too late, and his body quickly became a mangled mess. The severely mangled Bug collapsed to the ground, a pool of putrid blood pooling beneath him. He wheezed in pain, helpless as his mutilated limbs crawled toward the scattered souls, and by extension, their deaths. Dwayne saw this, and his expression couldn't help but darken. He'd already known Lag was a dark place, but never had he imagined he'd witness something like this. He tried to turn his eyes away, but deep down he knew it wouldn't help, because this was Lag and this was his new reality. Jeong, however, completely ignored the brutality, choosing to focus solely on Bug. So what if the current situation was tragic? Could it match up to the horrors he'd experienced in his regressions? Nah, fuck that. He'd rather focus on this Bug bastard because he still had a bone or two to pick with him. What was it he'd said to him a while back? Right. He wanted to hear the sound he'd make while dying. Well, the same was true for him. He too wanted to hear the sound Bug would make while dying. Bug caught the smug smirk on Jeong's lips and roared in rage. He'd known he was a vindictive person, but to think this Jeong bastard was equally as vindictive, if not petty. He roared in anguish, making sure to vent all his pent-up emotions. Jeong looked at the screaming Bug and responded calmly. Nice, that's how it should be. After all the trouble he'd caused him, he should at least struggle like that before he meets his end. Oh, and in case he thinks Lag would save him again with another ass-pull power-up, or his many lives would kick in, he should forget about that. Lag isn't so generous as to save a scam like him twice. As for the multiple lives, they were all linked to the faces on his body, and since those faces have already left him, he now has just the one life, his own. In other words, he was cooked, and there was nothing he could do about it. Blood sputtered at the end of his speech, and a dying whimper followed, proving Jeong stood on business. The panel then zoomed in on our boy, showing just how he'd ended the fiend. Death by stabbing. Of course, since Jeong is still him, he had to make it more flashy, so he drove the blade through Bug's neck. All in all, the bastard was finally dead, and Jeong collected his soul just to make sure. Dwayne, who'd at some point regrouped with Jeong, sighed in relief as he stared at the mangled corpse. He quickly suppressed his instinct to spit on it and turned to Jeong instead. With a serious face, he told Jeong he was done with this room and wanted to leave as soon as possible. Jeong said bet. He too wanted to leave that shit as quickly as possible. The duo thus moved forward, arriving at the room's exit soon after. Not wasting any time, they decisively walked out, causing the door to B713 to shut with a bang. After their departure, the duo found themselves in another room, this one way emptier than the last. To the side was a merchant's room, the perfect place to restock and regroup. Jeong sighed in relief at the sight. At least they weren't forced into a fight upon their arrival. If things continued like that, then he might just be tempted to believe their shitty luck had finally changed for the better. Dwayne chuckled by the side, almost as if he'd sensed Jeong's naive thoughts. He then called out to him, informing him that the merchant's door wouldn't open. Jeong's lips twitched. He immediately closed in on the door, all whilst cursing L.A.G for being shitty. Damn it. Couldn't it at least allow a brief second of happiness? Damn. Luckily, things weren't as bad as Jeong had imagined, and the vendor's door wasn't truly locked. Turns out the door needed a special key to open it, and that key was the labyrinth key. Jeong cracked a slight smile at the notification. Labyrinth key? Well, he did have one of those, so the door should be like Alibaba and Open Sesame in this bitch. He immediately pulled out the key and used it to unlock the vendor's door. Dwayne caught a glimpse of the key and shot Jeong a curious glance. He'd imagined the key would be the biggest obstacle in the room, but who would have thought Jeong Poppy had it on his person this entire time? Truly, he was him, and those nicknames weren't for show. Reining back his glazing, Dwayne asked Jeong where he'd procured the key. Jeong replied that it was a gift from the labyrinth boss. Well, technically, he did have to clap it all the way through Sunday. But yes, it could be considered a gift, especially with the miraculous effect the key had. Dwayne didn't pry further. Why should he, when he was benefiting for free? As for Jeong potentially clapping some unknown boss and getting a gift from it, why would he be surprised when the homie had been clapping mega cheeks ever since he'd known him? The only pity would be that the Chad's clapping only extended to monsters and never true maidens. If he had as much luck with the baddies as he did with the clapped bosses, then Jeong would truly be the honored one, and not the maidenless soul he currently was. Anyway, moving on from Dwayne's, or rather Not's, wild banter, the two Chads finally entered the room. Within it was a vendor, as you might have guessed, and also, surprisingly, medical pods. I'm not quite sure why those are in there, but hey, why question blessings when they fall in your lap? The duo certainly didn't, and eagerly nodded toward the vendor. The vendor Chad responded to the nod, informing them that he was down for business. Jeong smiled in relief and quickly made his way to the Chad. However, halfway through the walk, he realized something was off. After meeting several vendors in this life and his past regression, he noticed that this vendor was odd. At first, he didn't understand why he got that feeling, but a little bit of reflection immediately gave him an answer. The vendor Chad, in all his glory, was actually a short king. Jeong was taken aback by this, as it was the first time he'd seen a vendor so tiny. However, what did the vendor's height have to do with him? So long as the Chad could deliver on what he was supposed to and not shortchange him by overpromising and underperforming, he was good. He immediately told the short unit to show him his stuff, obviously eager to see what he was working with. The vendor said bet and proudly unveiled his package. Contrary to what you might have thought, the short king was indeed mighty. In fact, his package was so large that he had those 6 feet and over vendors beat. Without a doubt, this was a true testament to, it's not the size of the package that matters, but how you handle it. Pause. Moving on from the obviously sussy narration, we finally focus back on the story. Jeong, who was bewildered by Not's pervy thoughts, firmly ignored the sussy baka and turned his gaze to Dwayne. He advised the Chad to go all out and buy everything he needed. Since run-ins with vendors were pretty uncommon in L.A.G, he should use this chance and not waste it. Dwayne said okay and immediately stepped forward. He then bought everything he needed before leaving the spot to Jeong. After the two had completed the shopping spree, they made a quick detour to the medical pods, obviously using them to heal up to their peak condition. Done with that, the duo left the room, and it is also at this time that we see their new drip. For Jeong, the change wasn't as drastic, as he only added a bit of flavor to his already killer drip. For example, the Devil's Leather Jacket, formerly the Demon's Leather Jacket, had been enhanced a second time, making the total buffs double. His agility, as a result, had risen from 30% to 80%, provided he was nestled in the bosom of darkness. On his wrist was a new piece of equipment, specifically, the Shadow Demon's bracelet. The equipment allowed the use of an active skill. In the Shadow, ranked M. As for its effect, it basically channeled the Shadow Monarch, allowing for free and unrestricted movement through shadows. Apart from those two, Jeong also purchased Hydra Pants, which helped with health recovery and regeneration. Last was a bunch of medical supplies, the typical potions and pills. On the personal power front, or rather, the cheeks-clapping front. He'd purchased a total of 4 passive skills. I won't introduce them in detail because we all know the homie Jeong will just pull skills out of his ass so long as it suits him in battle. However, to satisfy the Chads and Chadlets with OCD, I'll briefly mention their names and have them on screen as I deliver this sweet and spicy voiceover. Hopefully, by the time this chatty voice finishes tickling your ears, and you also finish. Pause. All the relevant information should have been shown. Moving on, we also learned that Jeong had used a special feature, or rather, item, from the vendor to permanently swap a skill while maintaining the original level. The skills in question were the swordsmanship skill and the weapon mastery skill. The swordsmanship level 10 was swapped with the weapon mastery level 10. All in all, the big splash cost our boy a whopping 400 souls, and he only had 71 souls left in his pocket. Moving on, Jeong shifted his gaze to the unit Dwayne. The big poppy had also bought some new drip, but the author purposely, or maybe unintentionally, ignored it, so we don't get detailed info about it. However, he does look fly, so make sure to send your love to the Chad Dwayne. With the shopping and recovery done, the 2 units decisively walked to the next room, eager to tackle the new horrors. Dwayne, in particular, was so excited that he couldn't stop the slight bounce in his steps. He confidently walked forward, his new drip and swagger on full display. Jeong also felt confident and immediately led the way into the next room. What greeted them was a room covered in purple mist. The air in the room was both sultry and steamy, hinting at some debauchery going on. To the left and right of the hall were red-scented candles, which further added to the ambiance. As for the occupants of the room, well, let's just say they were rather occupied, clapping some literal cheeks. I know I joke about this a lot, but this time it's indeed true. Backs are genuinely being broken in this room. This Chad, for example, seems to have passed out, having completed a rather intense sesh. I'm not sure why he's drooling like that, but I can only assume the blonde baddie is a snatcher, so our boy probably got his soul snatched. To the side was another couple, all hot and steamy from the smash. Judging by how the maiden is laid out, we can assume our boy did his thing, and that back was properly cracked. Pause. Up on the pedestal was a live show with a session of soul snatching happening in real time. I don't know what the Chad is feeling, but with his back arched in like that, I can assume his soul is with Hades right now. Dwayne saw this and couldn't help but gulp in surprise. To think paradise had always been in L.A.G, and he had no idea this entire time. Jeong caught the foolish grin on his face and told him to lock in. Now wasn't the time to get lost in debauchery. Inwardly, however, he cursed his shitty luck, because this room was definitely going to be, hard. Speaking of hard, a new maiden joined the fray. She was the same demon who was currently snatching that lucky, I meant poor, Chad's soul on the pedestal. She cast a lust-filled glance at them, delighted that new prey had joined the party. Jeong spared her a glance before quickly turning his gaze away. Nothing good would come out of lingering on that view for long. He then addressed Dwayne, warning the latter to be careful. Something in that room was off, and it wasn't just the smashing going on. His instincts were telling him that the states of the players were abnormal, and it definitely had something to do with that succubus wench, Phoebe. Suppressing the lingering unease in his heart, Jeong reflected on his regressions thus far. He realized that this room, and probably the boss as well, were things he'd never encountered in his past regressions. He had no idea what was going on, but his ample experience told him the boss would be tricky to deal with. Sure, she looked weak on the outside, and her offensive power seemed to be lacking, but that was precisely why she would be tricky to handle. There were never weak bosses in L.A.G, and he was sure this wench had her quirks as well, although he very much dreaded experiencing them firsthand. Locking back in, he cast his gaze across the room. Ignoring the humping fools, he quickly realized there was no exit in sight. Dwayne grew tense at this, but Jeong told him not to worry. Handling the exit issue would be easy. All they had to do was smash, or rather beat, the boss, and the exit would naturally appear. As for how they'll do that, there was no need to rush. They could continue collecting visual data for now, for research purposes, of course. Phoebe heard Jeong's, or rather Not's, flimsy excuse and immediately cast her gaze over. She licked her lips, an unrestrained desire tugging on them. She then gulped at the new prey, obviously eager to give them a taste. Jeong noticed her strange expression and instantly went on high alert. He watched as she dismounted her worthy steed, and his heart ached a little for the poor fool. Seeing as he couldn't even close his mouth, it was safe to say the Chad was gone. Another pitiful fallen in the pursuit of cheeks. Offering the Chad a silent salute for his sacrifice, he focused his attention back on Fibichi. The succubus wench quickly donned her robe and stared intently at the boys. Before the duo could react, she instantly appeared before Jeong, her tongue already licking his chin. Jeong freaked out at this sight, and even the words he'd planned to say were caught in his mouth. He wondered how the wench had moved so fast, and how she'd done so without raising his alarm. However, that was something to be worried about later. For now, he should go ahead and deal with this fool, because his face wasn't for everyone to lick. He viciously swung his sword, delivering a nasty slash at Fibichi. Unfortunately, the baddie's speed was the real deal, so she easily dodged that shit. Jeong glanced at the escaped boss, and his face couldn't help but darken. He could have sworn she was just in front of him. So how had she gotten that far already? Not to mention, he'd felt a light weight on his attack, meaning he'd definitely hit something. So how did she escape so easily? Well, anyway, it didn't matter how she'd done it. All that mattered was his attack landed, and the bitch could at least be harmed. That aside, he also got a clear view of them boobies, so he'd say the exchange was rather fruitful. Speaking of exchange, Fibichi gave him a clearer view of the peaks before taunting him some more. She told him such wounds couldn't do shit to her, so he had to try way harder than that. Jeong returned her gaze but didn't fall for the taunt. Instead, he focused his attention on the mist on her lips, wondering what the hell it was. Soon, he realized the same mist was all over them, and his danger senses instantly flared. He immediately jumped back, warning Dwayne to do the same. The giant unit didn't hesitate and instantly followed suit. After they'd escaped, Jeong caught a slight sniff of the purple mist, and his face instantly heated. He cautiously stopped breathing and warned Dwayne to do the same. Although he still had no idea what the purple mist was, the subtle heat in his body, and his instincts as a man, were warning him to be careful. So he did just that. Fibichi noticed his quick reactions and stellar performance and frowned slightly. She instantly realized taking down the duo wouldn't be easy, especially with Jeong around. However, just because it was difficult didn't mean it was impossible. She had more than enough means to make it happen. That being said, she decisively deployed one of them, commanding her slaves to attack the duo. Jeong and Dwayne tensed up from the words, realizing it was bound to be a gruesome fight. They each picked a side of the room, with Dwayne handling the left and Jeong the right. As for Fibichi, she stayed back to watch the show, confident her depraved soldiers would handle the smoke. Jeong ignored her and locked in on the charging enemy. He'd initially thought this would be a tough battle, but judging by how the fool was charging at him recklessly, without even putting up his guard, he was compelled to reevaluate the situation. From the looks of it, the poor fool was out of his mind, and what was left was basic instincts, definitely insufficient to pose a threat to him. He thus locked in, zapping the shit out of the bastard. Maybe it was because he was drained from the smash, but the fool went down surprisingly quickly, eliciting a soft sigh from Jeong. This was good, as he didn't want to fight a long battle anyway. However, if there was a point to frown over, it would be that the bastard didn't drop a soul. Jeong was certain the fool was dead, so what was going on? Was there something he was missing? Or was L.A.G back to its shenanigans again? As he was still mulling things over, a loud roar bellowed from the side, drawing his attention. He turned just in time to catch Dwayne delivering a savage punch, completely caving a bastard's face in. However, contrary to the congratulatory thumbs up he wanted to give the Chad, his face suddenly turned somber as Fibichi had launched a sneak attack on Dwayne. The cunning wench had bided her time, choosing the best moment to attack. She instantly used her purple mist, blowing a whole fog of it up Dwayne's nose. Dwayne was caught unaware, and before he knew it, the mist was already in his system. Fuck. Jeong peeped this sight, and the unease in his heart drastically increased. He wanted to do something about it, but by then, it was already too late. Not to mention, Dwayne wasn't the only one in danger right now. Behind Jeong was a stalking foe who quickly used his moment of distraction to launch a sneak attack. She clung to our boy, making sure to smother him with the smoothness. Jeong savored the delicate peaks before yelling at the wench to get off. Inasmuch as he liked the heavenly feel, he knew now wasn't the time to get lost in that shit. He decisively grabbed the bitch's hand, doing his best to pry her off. However, to his surprise, despite his immense strength, he still couldn't pull the baddie off him. Maybe it was because of her innate ability, or that post-nut clarity had her on steroids. Either way, the maiden didn't budge. which greatly surprised Jeong. Just as he was about to resort to more desperate measures, a shout rang out from the side, yanking his attention. Jeong quickly turned to check, and his scalp instantly tingled. A new foe had joined the fray, and this one wasn't fucking around. He charged in, dick swinging, demanding for Jeong to give up the cheeks. Jeong said fuck that as he tore his gaze away from the D. He tried his best to get the wench off of him as he strived to dodge to the side. Unfortunately, the Chad read his intentions and instantly moved to intercept. He lunged in, dick first, ready to shove that thing down Jeong's face. Jeong said hell no and immediately dodged to the side. Luckily, he did so, as he narrowly avoided a dick bump to the face. As for the maiden on his back, he crashed that hoe into the wall, finally giving himself some wiggle room. With the well-sought reprieve, Jeong became more proactive, directly bringing the fight to the foe. He charged in, sword swinging, his rage and resentment evident. Never in his life had he ever been humiliated like this, and someone had to pay. And since he had a perfectly bricked up someone before him, that motherfucker would definitely be it. He drove his blade into his mouth, making sure he deep-throated that thing. When that wasn't enough, he twisted the blade a couple of times, showing his love and sincerity. Done with that, Jeong shifted his attention to the next prey on his list, the caked-up wench. He purposely left his back open, luring her to attack him. The baddie said, bet, and lunged at him immediately. She screamed at Jeong to play with her too since she was done watching the two have all the fun. Jeong's back itched at the comment, and he fiercely swung to decapitate this fool. What fun. What join in. Did she think the mighty him would have a choo-choo run on him? Nah, fuck that. He'd rather burn Lag to the ground than watch that happen. And if the gods themselves wanted that as well, then he'd burn them too. Done with his overdramatic and strangely overcompensating rhetoric, he studied the corpses some more. Just as he'd expected, the strange fools only gave him peeps of cheeks and boobs. There were no souls in sight. He wondered what was going on, but even that short second of silence was quickly interrupted. To his side was a looming foe, a sight that honestly startled Jeong. Dwayne, with all his glory, was currently held hostage by Fibichi, and his condition was truly peculiar. He had his head down, and wisps of purple mist slowly seeped from his nose. Not only that, a depraved look tinged his face, which greatly scared Jeong. Just as he was about to call out to him, the giant suddenly charged, forcing Jeong to lock in. He watched with bated breath as Dwayne lunged at him, a complicated feeling welling in his gut. Should he fight back, or should he take a beating? He had no idea what to do. However, even if he wanted to be passive, there was something he just couldn't ignore. Why the hell was Dwayne bricked up? What was going on in that head of his? If he thought this was that kind of diddy party, then he'd be greatly disappointed. He shouted at Dwayne to wake up all while fleeing in a frenzy. It wasn't that he was afraid of him, it's just that the situation left him no choice. Dwayne was his partner, so he couldn't attack him recklessly. Not to mention, Fibichi was still in the room, so he had to guard against her as well. Damn, this was proving to be more troublesome than he'd thought. Jeong blocked Dwayne's punches, purposefully using the force to backpedal. He'd hoped the Chad would snap out of it soon, but that was proving more and more unlikely. Instead, the aphrodisiac seemed to be seeping deeper into Dwayne's system. The unit had a glossy look in his eyes, and his words were getting vulgar. He told Jeong to surrender the cheeks, promising to be gentle with him. Jeong said fuck that, and backpedaled even faster. He did his best to escape the crazed Dwayne, but the horny fool was just too fast. Finally, he caught up to Jeong, landing a nasty punch on our boy. The force sent Jeong flying, causing him to crash pathetically against the wall. Jeong swiftly recovered and raised his hands to block any subsequent attacks. As he did so, he spared a second to mull over his situation. Although Dwayne was indeed mighty, he'd become like the other sex slaves, choosing to ignore defense in favor of offense. Sure, he was still formidable, but it was a far cry from what the peak unit could do. Jeong smirked at this realization. If it was just that much, then he could handle it somewhat. Just as the thought crossed his mind, Dwayne suddenly stopped, and a gust of wind blew around him. His aura swiftly changed, and a depraved look tinged his eyes. He then shouted his love for Jeong, begging the latter to obediently give up the cheeks. Jeong screamed at him to shut up. Even if he was under the influence of an aphrodisiac, this was just too much. If he didn't get his shit together, then he might as well say fuck it and fight back. Dwayne, however, ignored that shit. Since Jeong was playing deaf to his confession, then he might as well scream it louder. He immediately drew in a deep breath, bellowing out a beast roar soon after. The roar hit Jeong hard, forcing him back against the wall. His already perilous situation instantly worsened, causing a slight panic to flash across his face. However, he was still him, so he held on with all he had. As he stared at the roaring Dwayne, Jeong realized something he'd overlooked this entire time. Dwayne was strong. It was only after he'd experienced it firsthand that he could truly appreciate just how much the unit had grown. Had it been any other time, he might have been delighted by this. However, the current situation didn't allow for that. Not only was his life in danger, but his chastity as well. Thus, he swiftly dodged to the side, narrowly avoiding a stomp kick and a subsequent pounding by Dwayne. Jeong saw the crashed wall and his resolve steeled. He finally realized a passive approach wouldn't work. If he wanted to make it out alive, then he had to start returning punches. Thus, he savagely clocked Dwayne, sending the unit skidding into the distance. Dwayne felt the pain, but his horny ass easily ignored it. What was a mere pain when he hadn't shown Jeong his sweet loving? He decisively lunged back, his depravity intensifying by a nudge. Jeong's mood sank at this sight. Did the Chad really not tire? Or was the aphrodisiac mixed with that Colombian sauce? In any case, things weren't looking good, and he desperately needed a plan. Just as he was contemplating his next step, a sultry voice whispered from behind him, causing his back to stiffen. The voice was obviously from Fibichi, who had at some point sneaked up on Jeong. She immediately blew her mist toward him, hoping to trap him as well. However, Jeong sensed the danger and instantly stopped breathing. He then covered his nose, making sure not to inhale any of the mist. As for Fibichi, he headbutted the bitch, forcing her to retreat. Unfortunately, this left his front open, which Dwayne promptly took advantage of. He bashed our boy, sending him flying like a ragdoll. Jeong hit the wall with a thud, a sickening crack echoing around him. He weakly fell to his knees, an anguished breath escaping his lips. When he finally collected himself, a savage glint flashed across his eyes. He realized the time for jokes was over. If things continued to develop like that, then he might just die by Dwayne's hands before he even fought Fibici. Obviously, that was unacceptable to him, so he had to lock in. Dwayne, who was still controlled by his lust, continued his assault, completely unaware of the shadows surrounding Jeong. He lunged forward, seemingly oblivious to the obvious power-up Jeong was going through. He punched forward, sending a nasty hook toward Jeong. However, the punch met nothing but stone, as the unit was already gone. Well, technically, it wasn't stone, but rather Jeong's hand, as the Chad had literally caught the punch. Yes, I shit you not, our boy had caught Dwayne's punch. Talk about aura farming. Nestled in the bosom of darkness, Jeong unveiled his new transformation. He looked kinda like a budget Jin Woo, but that's neither here nor there. In any case, his aura in this new form was enough to make Dwayne pause, which in turn gave him an opening to counterattack. He warned Dwayne to snap out of it because he was done fucking around. He'd come too far to fall in a place like this, and in such a pathetic way. If the Chad didn't wake up now, he'd have no choice but to kill him. Fibici heard Jeong's warning and chuckled slightly. Kill him? Did he truly have it in him to do so? Regardless, he was right about something. And that was it was time to end that shit. Sure, she would have loved to play with him further, but he was just too damn troublesome, so it was best if they ended it there. However, he shouldn't be sad because she had the best parting gift for him. Behind her was a veiled silhouette, probably the so-called gift. Jeong glared at her and said, "Cool." Since he'd decided to clap mega cheeks, it didn't matter to him whether it was 2 or 3. Fibici should bring out all her slaves because he was about to run a train in this bitch.